Before temple bells rang over the Ganges or Sanskrit hymns echoed in forest groves, there were only winds over stone and the quiet patience of the land. The story of India begins not with kings, but with silence broken only by the scrape of stone tools and footsteps along a dry riverbed. Over 10,000 years ago, the subcontinent was home to wandering hunters following elephants and wild cattle across endless plains. They painted on cave walls and gathered roots beside rivers that would later become sacred, the Sarasvati, the Indus, the Ganga. But around 7000 BCE, something quietly revolutionary happened. In the arid hills of today's Balochistan, near a place now called Mehrgarh, a small community stopped moving. They planted seeds. It seems humble, yet it changed everything. They sowed barley and wheat, domesticated goats and cattle, built granaries, and wove cotton cloth. For the first time, life wasn't a chase for food. It was a rhythm of seasons. People could stay plan and dream further ahead. They shaped copper tools, fired pottery, and crafted ornaments of shell and turquoise. Among their ruins, archaeologists have found tiny clay goddesses, broad-hipped, serene hints of early belief and hope. Mehrgarh stood near a prehistoric trade route linking Mesopotamia and Central Asia. Even then, beads and ideas traveled farther than their makers could imagine. For nearly 3 millennia, its people farmed, traded, and built, spreading agriculture eastward to the fertile floodplains of the Indus River. There they learned to live with the monsoon storing channeling and taming its waters. With each harvest came surplus, with surplus population, and with population specialization. By 4000 Hassan, 3000, BCE villages had grown into proto-towns. Pottery became standardized crafts refined, and trade in lapis lazuli, carnelian, and copper stretched across the plains. Smoke curled from hearths. Women ground grain. Men shaped clay under the sun. The Indus floods renewed the soil each year. Then came a quiet miracle. Streets began to align. Wells multiplied, bricks matched in size as if some invisible architect had whispered, "Let there be order." Humanity was standing on the threshold of one of its first great experiments, urban civilization. If you stand today among the mounds of Mehrgarh, you can still find their traces: a shard of pottery, a turquoise bead, the tooth of a child. Small things, yet each holds a heartbeat from the dawn of history. Civilization, it turns out, doesn't begin with monuments. It begins with memory. And from those memories, from the first fires that glowed against the night, the earliest light of ancient India began to rise. If you were to drift east from the dusty hills of Mehrgarh, you'd eventually see it broad and bronze under the sun, winding like a slow-moving god through a plain of endless green. The Indus River. It was here sometime around 2600 BCE that human order leapt from village to city. And not just a few clusters of huts, but true urban marvels so advanced that even millennia later, they still look modern in spirit. The people who built them didn't carve their stories on temple walls or leave behind self-congratulatory statues. They left drains, lots of them. Miles of covered brick sewers running beneath streets, perfectly laid out on a grid. Every home, rich or modest, had access to running water and sanitation. Archaeologists call this the Indus Valley Civilization, or the Harappan Civilization, after one of its first excavated cities. But really, it was an entire world, thousands of settlements, spread from Afghanistan to Gujarat, all pulsing with the same quiet rhythm of organization and intent. Walk its streets in your imagination. Wide avenues cross each other at right angles, paved with baked bricks of identical size, as if every builder had followed one master code. The houses stand shoulder to shoulder, each with a central courtyard open to the sky. Wells descend deep into the water table. Stairs climb to second floors. You can almost hear the splash of a bucket, the chatter of merchants, the soft hiss of ovens firing pottery. At the heart of Mohenjo-Daro lies something scholars still speak about in awe: the Great Bath, a massive sunken pool lined with bricks sealed with bitumen to make it watertight and fed by a sophisticated system of drains and steps. Was it a place for ritual purification, communal gathering, a kind of Bronze Age spa day? We don't know, but we can sense the reverence in its design. Even in antiquity, water was not just survival. It was sanctity. What makes the Indus cities extraordinary isn't their monuments, it's their egalitarian feel. There are no pyramids, no colossal kings carved in stone, no royal tombs screaming, "Look upon my works, ye mighty." Instead, there is uniformity, weights, measures, bricks, pottery styles, all standardized across an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. It's as if millions of people spread across 1,000 kilometers agreed silently on how a civilization should function. And yet, despite such coordination, we still don't know their names. Their script, stamped on thousands of tiny seals, has resisted every attempt at translation. Each bears a short line of symbols, some geometric, some animal, some abstract. Elephants, tigers, unicorn-like creatures, bulls. Beneath them, a few dozen characters, elegant and maddeningly silent. No bilingual Rosetta Stone has ever turned up, so the Indus people speak to us only through objects, beads, tools, clay figurines, the bones of their cities. We can, however, read their habits. They traded with Mesopotamia, the great civilization between the Tigris and Euphrates. Sumerian tablets mention a distant land called Meluha, a place of lapis lazuli ivory and cotton. Harappan seals have been found in ancient Ur and Lagash, while Mesopotamian cylinder seals have turned up in Harappan ruins. Ships from Indus ports like Lothal likely hugged the Arabian coast, carrying carnelian beads, sesame oil, and woven cloth. Imagine that tiny boats crossing vast seas without compasses, powered by faith in the monsoon winds. Daily life here would seem surprisingly relatable. Farmers grew wheat, barley, dates, and famously cotton, possibly the earliest cultivated in the world. The river's floods enriched the soil, and irrigation channels brought water to the fields. Herds of zebu cattle grazed near the town walls. Craftsmen carved shell and agate into jewelry, copper into tools, and terracotta into toys. Children had clay carts with little wheels that actually turned. Somewhere, a parent surely stepped on one barefoot and swore in whatever language they spoke. Despite their complexity, the cities feel strangely democratic. The largest house on a street isn't a palace, it's just slightly bigger. There are no obvious temples or ziggurats towering above the populace. Power here seems to have been civic, not divine. The society functioned through cooperation rather than coercion, an ancient urban social contract. It's almost utopian until you remember that every utopia eventually meets reality. By 1900 BCE, something began to falter. Long-distance trade with Mesopotamia waned. Kilns cooled. Streets filled with debris that no one cleared. The once mighty Indus changed its course. The Sarasvati, that mythical river of later hymns, dried into desert. Climate shifted, the monsoon weakened. Crops failed, and cities began to empty, not through conquest, but attrition. The end came not with swords, but with silence. Even so, the Indus people didn't vanish. They melted back into smaller villages, carrying fragments of their culture, their ways of measuring their crafts, their reverence for cleanliness into later generations. When future migrants arrived from the northwest, bringing new languages and gods, they found not wilderness, but memory bricks, still warm from an earlier dream. And what a dream it was. Think about it 5,000 years ago, before the Great Wall of China or the pyramids at Giza reached their final form, families here had indoor plumbing, municipal drainage, standardized weights, even a proto-logistics network that spanned continents. They balanced complexity with subtlety. They managed urban life without visible kings or armies. Their civilization was measured not in monuments, but in maintenance. Perhaps that's why they fascinate us. They built the infrastructure of modernity, then quietly disappeared before history learned how to spell their names. Their bricks lie under fields where farmers still plant barley and wheat, the same crops that began this story. Every time a plow turns the soil near Harappa or Mohenjo-daro, it passes through layers of humanity stacked like pages of an unwritten epic. The Indus world left no heroic tales, no grandiose boasts, just the hum of organization and the scent of baked earth after rain. And yet, its influence never entirely faded. Its echoes lived on in the planned cities of later ages, in the love of symmetry, in the Indian obsession with ritual cleanliness, and in that quiet belief that civilization is less about conquest and more about cooperation. There's something haunting about a city built to last that slowly forgets why it exists. For more than 7 centuries, the cities of the Indus Valley hummed with order, streets swept clean granaries, full merchants tallying goods, with carved seals and uniform weights. Then somewhere around 1900 BCE, that rhythm began to falter. The straight streets no longer ran straight. Bricks were reused in haphazard repairs. The drains, those prideful veins of the ancient world, started to clog, and no one cleared them. The decline of the Indus civilization wasn't a single catastrophe. It was more like a long, slow exhale, the quiet unraveling of a masterpiece. And because its people left no written record, we're left to reconstruct their final act through fragments, a broken figurine here, a deserted kiln, there a flood layer buried under dust. Each clue whispers part of a mystery that still hasn't been solved. The first suspects are the same culprits that have ended so many human dreams: climate and water. The monsoon, that life-giving force which had nourished the Indus plains for millennia, began to shift. Droughts lengthened, floods grew unpredictable, and entire rivers betrayed their courses. The Ghaggar Hakra River, which many scholars associate with the legendary Sarasvati of Vedic hymns, seems to have dried out during this time. Where once its waters carried silt and sustenance, now there was only cracked earth. Imagine it: farmers staring at empty irrigation channels, fields turning to dust, families forced to pack what they could onto ox-drawn carts and move in search of steadier rain. The mighty cities, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Kalibangan, Lothal, didn't fall to invasion or fire. They simply starved of water, the quietest and most devastating enemy of all. But the weather alone can't explain everything. Some regions flooded, others dried out. Trade routes shifted as well. The sea receded from certain ports. New deltas formed elsewhere. The ancient link with Mesopotamia, the flow of beads and cotton, copper, and ivory, collapsed. Sumerian merchants stopped writing about Meluha. Without that exchange, the economy that had once tied the cities together began to crumble. It's possible the Indus world was simply too interconnected, too dependent on balance. When one link in the chain snapped, the rest followed. The cities were marvels of coordination, but perhaps that very efficiency made them fragile. They had no kings or warrior class to reorganize society by decree. No single god king to rally people around a symbol of unity. Their strength was order, and order can dissolve quietly once no one's left to enforce it. Archaeologists have found eerie evidence of abandonment. Houses left half-built, streets where garbage piled up, skeletons hastily buried, sometimes in strange postures. In Mohenjo-daro, one layer of ruins reveals bodies lying in the streets, though not the result of massacre, more likely disease or disaster. A city once engineered to perfection, reduced to rubble by the steady, invisible hand of entropy. And yet, this wasn't an apocalyptic end. Civilization didn't collapse overnight. It decentralized. As the great cities shrank, their people drifted east and south toward the plains of the Ganges and the hills of Gujarat. They carried with them habits of craft and structure. Even as urban life faded, the idea of organized community endured. Pottery styles continued. Terracotta toy seals and ornaments show remarkable continuity. It's as if the civilization didn't die. It quietly reabsorbed itself into the countryside. By 1700 BCE, the once vast urban web had splintered into smaller regional cultures, the cemetery H culture in Punjab, the late Harappan phase in Gujarat, the painted grayware traditions beginning to form further east. None could match the grandeur of Harappa or Mohenjo-daro, but each kept a small ember of the old world alive. A drainage channel here, a brick mold there, a kind of cultural muscle memory refusing to fade. If you visited Mohenjo-daro in those final centuries, you might not have noticed the end right away. Life went on. The bazaar still clattered with pots and tools. The great bath may have stood half-filled with rainwater, its steps worn smooth by generations. But gradually, fewer hands repaired the walls. Roofs collapsed. The songs of the city turned to silence. And so by around 1300 BCE, the Indus civilization, once larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, was gone. Not conquered, not burned, just gone. Its people scattered its script, forgotten its name, lost to time. For the next 1,000 years, India's story would be told by new voices in new tongues under new gods. Yet even in disappearance, the Indus left fingerprints on the future. Later, Vedic traditions would revere rivers and cleanliness, echoing those ancient drainage-loving engineers. The emphasis on order, on ritual purification, on symmetry, all of it feels like the Indus whispering from beneath the sands. Even the ideal of harmony between humans and water, so central to Indian life, may trace back to these early urbanists who built entire cities around the rhythm of the flood. There's something profoundly human in their story. We tend to think of collapse as tragedy, but the Indus decline was more like metamorphosis. When the cities failed, people adapted. They moved to greener lands, mixed with new migrants from the northwest, and began to shape what would become the next chapter of India's past, the Vedic age. If we could meet one of them, a potter from Harappa, or a farmer from Lothal, and tell them their civilization would one day vanish beneath the dust, perhaps they'd smile and say it was never about the cities anyway. The rivers flow, the rains return, the soil remembers. Today, as satellites trace the ghostly outlines of dried riverbeds across Pakistan and India, we can see how enormous their world once was, an intricate grid of humanity stretching from the Himalayas to the Arabian Sea. And though we can't read their script, their silence speaks volumes. It tells us that progress doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, builds, endures for a time, and then, like the Indus itself, changes course. Stand among their ruins on a hot afternoon, and you can almost feel it. The sun beating down on endless baked bricks. The faint smell of salt and clay. A dry wind moving through empty streets that once echoed with life. In that wind is the sound of every civilization that ever dared to think it had mastered time. The cities of the Indus had fallen silent, their bricks sleeping under dust. But somewhere beyond the mountains to the northwest, a different kind of world was stirring, a world of open skies, galloping horses, and songs carried by memory rather than stone. Around 1500 BCE, give or take a few generations, groups of Indo-Aryan tribes began moving into the plains of northern India. Their story is tangled with myth and migration, with language and legend. Were they conquerors, wanderers, simply seekers of new pasture? The truth, as always, is less cinematic and more human. They came in waves, families and clans following their herds, drawn by the fertile valleys and endless grasslands of the Punjab. To the settled descendants of the Indus, these newcomers must have seemed both strange and familiar. They were pastoralists, not city builders. They spoke an early Indo-European tongue that would one day blossom into Sanskrit, and their lives revolved around cattle fire and the rhythm of the seasons. They traveled in ox carts and chariots, bringing with them a culture rich in hymn and ritual, a culture that saw the universe as a grand conversation between humans and the gods. They called those hymns the Vedas, literally knowledge. The earliest of them, the Rig Veda, is a collection of more than 1,000 verses addressed to deities who ruled the forces of nature. Indra, the thunder-wielding warrior, was their champion. Agni, the fire, their messenger. Varuna, the keeper of cosmic law, their judge. And Surya, the sun, their radiant witness. Picture a night on the plains, a circle of men and women gathered around a fire. The flames crackle, sparks rise into the starlit sky. A priest-poet called a RSI chants verses in a cadence that has traveled from the steppes of Central Asia to this Indian plain. His voice carries the same rhythm as the hooves of horses, the same pulse as thunder. Each word is sacred sound, each offering of butter or grain into the fire, a dialogue with the divine. To the Indo-Aryans, the universe was not a machine to be controlled, but a balance to be maintained. They spoke of Urta, cosmic order, the invisible principle that keeps the stars aligned and the rivers flowing. To live in harmony with Urta was to keep the world from falling into chaos, and the way to preserve it was through sacrifice, precise rituals, where every syllable, every gesture, every spark of flame mattered. Their society revolved around kinship groups called janas, each led by a chieftain or rajan. Leadership was earned through valor and generosity rather than divine birthright. The rajan shared power with tribal assemblies, sabha and samiti, where elders debated policy and warriors voiced their opinions. It was, in a sense, an early form of participatory politics, though one limited to the elite men of the tribe, while everyone else probably just rolled their eyes and waited for decisions to trickle down. Cattle were the currency of life. Wealth wasn't counted in coins or land, but in cows. Battles were often fought over herds, and victory songs boasted of thousands of cattle captured from rival tribes. A good king was one who distributed wealth generously, Danavara, the giver of gifts. This generosity was both political strategy and moral duty. Prosperity circulated, alliances strengthened, and poets sang your name forever. In this world, power was fluid, mobile, and deeply tied to language. The spoken word carried mystical potency. To recite a verse correctly was to align oneself with cosmic truth. The priests, brahmanas, became the custodians of this verbal power, preserving every accent and pause through oral recitation so precise that even today, thousands of years later, those same hymns are still chanted in their original cadence. There were no temples, yet no permanent idols. Worship took place in open air, under the same sky that inspired the hymns. The altar was a simple square of earth, the sacrifice a conversation of fire and breath. Life was cyclical, birth, death, rebirth. The sun rose, the rains came, the fire was lit again. And through it all, there was poetry, astonishing poetry. The Rig Veda isn't a manual of dry rituals. It's a lyrical chronicle of awe. It sings of dawn as a goddess robed in light of rivers, racing like wild horses of warriors who ride into battle with thunderclouds for armor. One hymn marvels at creation itself, asking almost cheekily, who even knows how it all began? Did the gods come after creation or before? Perhaps the poet admits even he who looks down from heaven does not know. That's not dogma. That's curiosity carved into verse. Yet the Vedic world wasn't some peaceful utopia of poetry and cow worship. It was competitive, restless, full of tribal rivalries. The most famous conflict preserved in song is the Battle of the 10 Kings, fought along the Ravi River, between a confederation of tribes and the Paradas, whose chieftain Sudas emerged victorious. It's part history, part myth, part Bronze Age action movie, complete with chariots flooding rivers and divine intervention. Weapons advanced too. The Indo-Aryans brought with them the horse-drawn chariot light, and deadly powered by spoked wheels, a technological marvel for its time. Chariots gave speed and prestige, in battle symbols of divine favor. And when the warriors weren't fighting, they raced them for sport, probably terrifying every cow within a 5-mile radius. Despite their mobility, the Indo-Aryans weren't perpetual nomads. Over generations, they began to settle. Villages appeared along the rivers. Agriculture returned, mixed with pastoralism. The rhythm of ritual kept social life coherent. Over time, those loose tribal structures hardened into hierarchies. The Varna system's social orders that would later evolve into caste took root. At first, it was functional priests, warriors, herders, and laborers, each contributing to the balance of Arta. But human nature, being what it is, equality didn't last long. Power prefers permanence, and soon the priestly brahmanas found themselves claiming divine authority to match their linguistic mastery. Still in this early age, that rigidity hadn't yet crystallized. People moved between roles. Kings performed sacrifices with priests, and commoners joined rituals. The community's strength lay in its fluidity. This was an era still exploring what civilization could mean without walls or drains, an age of sound, not stone. Meanwhile, cultural cross-currents flowed. The descendants of the old Indus world likely mingled with the newcomers, exchanging skills, crafts, perhaps even myths. The river valleys filled again with life-simpler villages, replacing the vanished cities. From this merging of traditions, Indus ingenuity and Aryan imagination, the foundations of Indian civilization, were quietly laid anew. If the Indus people taught humanity how to build, the Indo-Aryans taught it how to speak. Their hymns gave the subcontinent its first remembered words, its first philosophies, its first glimpse of cosmic law. They looked at lightning and saw a god, looked at order and named it sacred, looked at speech and called it creation itself. When night fell on those early settlements and the stars shimmered like sparks from the ritual fire, the people must have felt both awe and belonging. The earth was still vast and mysterious, but now it spoke a language they understood, the language of flame and word of offering and echo. By now, the world of the Indo-Aryans had taken shape not as an empire of bricks and streets like the Indus, but as an empire of sound. Their civilization wasn't built with walls. It was built with words, verses, and memory. If the Harappans were engineers of stone, these people were engineers of the invisible, of breath chant, and the sacred fire that tied heaven and earth together. Picture a dawn, somewhere along the banks of the Ravi or the Ganges. A priest kneels before a square altar made of packed clay. The fire crackles smoke rising straight into the pale sky. He murmurs hymns in a language already ancient, his cadence measured by the beating of his heart. Butter hisses as it touches the flame. A few grains of barley scatter in the air, and for a moment it feels as if the cosmos is listening. To the Indo-Aryans, this was not symbolism, it was physics. Fire was the telephone line between humans and gods, and the priest was the operator. This sacred world revolved around ritual, But the rituals weren't static or mindless. They were performances, art philosophy, and social glue in one. Each sacrifice, or yajna, was a negotiation with the divine. The gods offered rain victory, or children. Humans repaid with hymns and offerings. Everyone had a role to play. The priest, who recited the patron, who paid the helper, who fetched the sacred fuel. Society itself mirrored this structure, each person a verse in the cosmic poem. Out of this order emerged a social classification that would outlast kingdoms, the Varna system. In theory, it wasn't about status, but function, a cosmic division of labor. At the top were the Brahmanas, keepers of ritual knowledge. Next, the Kshatriyas, warriors and rulers. Then the Vaishyas, herders and traders. And finally, the Shudras, the servants and workers. In practice, of course, humans being humans, the hierarchy soon hardened into privilege and exclusion. But in these early centuries, it was still fluid, more guideline than prison. A king might perform the duties of a priest, and a priest might wield a sword if he had to. Their wealth was measured not in gold or land, but in cattle. Cows weren't just animals. They were living currency moving banks of milk, labor, and status. Wars were fought for them, hymns praised them, and sacrifices required them. The word for war itself, gavishti, literally meant a search for cows. If you ever find yourself wondering why the cow later became sacred in India, the answer glows. Right here in the Bronze Age, it was the center of life economy and survival. The Indo-Aryans were still semi-nomadic, but their sense of community was strong. Families formed Gotras lineages, tracing descent from mythical ancestors, while clans united into Janas tribal groups ruled by chieftains called Rajans. These leaders were chosen by assemblies of elders and warriors. Their power depended on charisma, generosity, and success in cattle raids. The Rajan who shared his spoils became beloved. The one who hoarded them quickly found himself replaced. Even kingship in this world was a kind of contract. Festivals and sacrifices were the lifeblood of society. The community gathered in open meadows, drums beating, fires blazing. Poets, artists chanted hymns that were part prayer, part epic, part stand-up poetry night. They could improvise verses so eloquent that even gods were said to pause and listen. The rhythm of speech, the vibration of sound, Vak, the goddess of the spoken word, was worshipped as divine power itself. Language wasn't merely a tool, it was creation. In their worldview, the universe was born not from clay or chaos, but from a word spoken at the right pitch, at the right time. In this age of sound, the Brahmanas emerged as the rock stars of the spiritual world. Their mastery of chant memorization and ritual precision was unmatched. Some hymns were so long and complex that a single misplaced syllable could, they believed, ruin the sacrifice, or worse, summon the wrong deity. To prevent such disasters, entire schools of priests dedicated their lives to oral perfection. No writing, no papyrus, no safety net, just the human voice, passing knowledge down through centuries with terrifying accuracy. Meanwhile, the material world was changing too. Iron had not yet arrived, but copper and bronze tools improved farming. Settlements grew larger and more stable. The forests of the Ganges plain beckoned dense, wet, and full of promise. As clans migrated eastward, they began clearing land for agriculture. Plows cut into virgin soil, and barley and millet gave way to rice. The air smelled of smoke and fertility. Civilization, once lost in the ruins of Harappa, was returning in a new form, rural, oral, and vividly alive. But beneath the harmony, tension brewed. As rituals became more elaborate, so did their cost. Only wealthy patrons could afford the grandest sacrifices, the Ashvamedha horse sacrifice, or the Rajasuya royal consecration. These ceremonies, requiring hundreds of priests, vast resources, and occasionally a wandering horse that symbolically claimed territories were less about faith and more about power. They turned religion into politics and priests into gatekeepers of legitimacy. Still, the spiritual imagination of the Vedic world was astonishingly open. The hymns didn't speak of sin and punishment, but of balance and reciprocity. Gods weren't omnipotent tyrants. They were cosmic functionaries dependent on human offerings to maintain their strength. Even Indra, the thunder god, occasionally needed a drink of soma, the mysterious ritual beverage whose identity scholars still debate. Some say it was an intoxicating plant, others a metaphor for divine ecstasy. Whatever it was, the poets loved it. Hymn after hymn praises soma's shimmering juice, its ability to lift the mind to heaven. "We have drunk soma," one verse declares proudly. "We have become immortal." You can almost hear the hangover in the next line. As centuries passed, the Indo-Aryan world expanded and diversified. Tribes splintered, alliances shifted, new dialects emerged. The focus of power slowly moved eastward toward the fertile Ganges Valley. Here, the forests were dense, the rivers wild, and clearing land was backbreaking work. But the reward was abundance. Iron would soon arrive to help cut trees and plow fields, transforming these scattered tribes into kingdoms. Yet even as the material world changed, the spiritual world deepened. Beneath the chants and sacrifices, whispers of doubt began to stir. What if the gods themselves were only symbols? What if the real fire burned not in the altar, but in the heart? The poets who would ask these questions, those of the Upanishads, had not yet appeared, but the seeds of introspection were already there, smoldering beneath the surface. For now, though, the people still gathered at dawn facing the fire. Smoke rose, chants flowed, and the priests invoked Agni, Indra, Varuna, and a pantheon that felt both human and cosmic. Somewhere in that light, the echoes of the vanished Indus merged with the new rhythm of Sanskrit verse. Civilization had been reborn, not in brick, but in breath. The world of the Vedas began with fire, bright, precise, ceremonial. But as centuries passed, the flames grew quieter, the smoke curled upward, and so did the minds of those who tended it. What began as ritual performance was slowly turning into philosophy, and India, once a land of song and sacrifice, was on the verge of its first great inward revolution. By the first millennium BCE, the Indo-Aryans had spread deep into the Ganges plains, carving settlements out of the forests. Villages grew into small kingdoms, kings into patrons of grand sacrifices, and priests into a learned elite who held the keys to cosmic order. Yet somewhere between the crackle of the fire and the rhythm of the chant, a subtle shift occurred. The question was no longer how to perform a ritual perfectly, but why. The old hymns had given humans a universe alive with gods, Indra's thunder, Agni's fire, Varuna's law. But they also gave them something more dangerous: curiosity. If chanting a verse could move the heavens, what did that say about the nature of speech, of sound, of the self that spoke it? If sacrifice kept the world alive, what was being offered, and to whom? To answer these questions, new kinds of texts began to appear. The Brahmanas, Aranyakas, and eventually the Upanishads, each peeling back another layer of meaning from the same ancient hymns. Together, they mark one of the most extraordinary transformations in human thought religion, turning into philosophy ritual, evolving into reflection. The Brahmanas were the first step in this evolution. Composed between roughly 900 and 700 BCE, they were massive prose commentaries explaining how the rituals of the Vedas were to be performed and why they mattered. Every gesture, every syllable, every drop of melted butter had a cosmic purpose. The world, they said, was a vast sacrificial altar, and humans were its priests. If the ceremony was done properly, the sun would rise, the rains would fall, and the order of the cosmos RTA would remain intact. It was in its own way a grand system of metaphysics disguised as a manual of procedures. The universe was not random, it was structure. But even within these dense ritual texts, a quiet unease began to shimmer. Some passages asked questions that rituals couldn't answer. If the sacrifice sustains the gods, one author wondered who sustains the sacrifice. And that question, that dangerous little loop of logic, pushed certain minds away from the bustling villages and the smoky altars into the stillness of the forests. There, on the edges of settled life, a new kind of thinker emerged, the forest hermit, or Aranyaka, literally the man of the wilderness. They were still part of the Vedic tradition, but their concerns had shifted. For them, the sacrifice was no longer an external drama, but an internal process. The fire altar, that was the heart, the sacred flame, consciousness itself. They began to say things that would puzzle even the most faithful priest. The sun is not out there, it rises within you. The fire you tend is the mind that burns in thought. This was radical stuff. The Aranyakas, the forest texts that grew from their reflections, blurred the line between ritual and meditation. The old ceremonies were reinterpreted as metaphors for inner experience. Instead of feeding the gods, one now sought to know the self. And then came the Upanishads, the sittings down, near named for the way students sat close to their teachers under the trees. Composed between roughly 800 and 500 BCE, these dialogues mark the moment when Indian civilization first turned its gaze fully inward. Here the chants became questions, and the questions became philosophy. They asked things that even today sound audacious. What is the self? What is that knowing which everything is known? Who am I when the body dies and the breath departs? The answers they offered were equally astonishing. Beneath all changing forms of existence, they said there is a single unchanging reality, Brahman. It is not a god among gods, not a being at all, but being itself, limitless, formless, the ground of everything that is. And the self-Atman is not separate from it. Atman is Brahman, says one Upanishad, and you are that. It's hard to overstate how revolutionary this idea was. The priests had long spoken of pleasing the gods. Now the sages spoke of becoming one with the divine. The focus shifted from offering to understanding, from outer ritual to inner realization. The human and the cosmic were no longer two realms. They were mirrors facing each other. The tone of these texts feels startlingly modern. In the Chandogya Upanishad, a father named Uddalaka teaches his son Shvetaketu about the essence of reality using salt dissolved in water. You cannot see the salt, he says, yet it is everywhere. So is the self. In the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, a philosopher king named Janaka debates a sage on the nature of immortality. And when asked what remains after death, the sage answers, the self-pure awareness. If the Vedas were sung to gods in the sky, the Upanishads whispered to the god within. And yet these weren't rejections of the old ways, they were transformations. The fire sacrifice didn't disappear. It turned inward. Knowledge replaced action. Contemplation replaced performance. The word karma, which once simply meant ritual act, began to take on deeper meanings: action, cause, and effect, moral consequence. Life itself became a field of ritual, every choice an offering. It was also during this time that the idea of rebirth gained philosophical shape. If the self was eternal, then death couldn't be an ending, only a transition. And if our actions had cosmic weight, then one's future life was shaped by one's deeds in this one. Thus emerged the great moral and metaphysical triad that would define Indian thought for millennia: karma samsara, the cycle of birth and death, and moksha liberation. No longer was salvation something bestowed by a god. It was something realized by insight. To know the self was to break free from the wheel of rebirth, to wake up from the dream of individuality and see oneself as infinite. Imagine how disorienting this must have felt in its time. The old certainties of the village ritual hierarchy tribe were being replaced by a philosophy that said, in essence, you are the universe. The kings still performed sacrifices to maintain cosmic order, but the hermits in the forest whispered that the true order was within. One civilization had built its greatness on the precision of ritual. Another was now building its wisdom on the precision of introspection. The forest was never meant to last forever. By the turn of the first millennium, BCE, the hum of chanting hermits was joined by a new sound iron striking wood. The Ganges Plain, once a vast jungle, alive with elephants and monsoon mists, was being carved open by the axe and the plow. The world was changing again, and with it, the story of India was stepping out of the ritual firelight and into the clang of metal trade and power. Iron had arrived a quiet revolution in ore. The old copper tools that had fed and housed the early Vedic tribes were no match for this new black metal pulled from the earth. It could fell trees, slice through roots, and turn dense forests into farmland. The Ganges Basin, rich with alluvial soil, became a frontier of opportunity. Farmers cleared land, dug irrigation channels, and watched the rice harvests swell. From those fertile fields rose not just crops, but cities. Village by village, the tribes of the Vedic age grew roots. The loose confederations of clans, the janas, began to form stable territories known as janapadas, literally footholds of the people. At first, these were modest domains ruled by local chieftains, but prosperity has a way of multiplying ambition, and soon the janapadas expanded, absorbing neighbors and rivals, until they evolved into the Mahajanapadas, the great realms. By the 6th century BCE, 16 such Mahajanapadas dotted the northern subcontinent, stretching from the foothills of the Himalayas to the plains of Bengal and as far west as modern Afghanistan. Their names still echo faintly in the pages of early Buddhist and Jain texts: Magadha Kosala, Vatsa, Avanti, Kuru Panchala, Malavadji, and others. Some were monarchies ruled by kings who claimed divine sanction. Others were republics or oligarchies governed by assemblies of nobles, a political experiment that in its own way rivaled those taking shape in Greece at the same time. Among them, all one kingdom would rise higher and last longer than the rest Magadha. Its fertile lands lay in what is now Bihar, fed by the Ganges and Sun rivers. Its abundance of iron ore, elephants, and timber gave it the resources to forge an empire. But that story, the rise of Magadha, was still a few acts away. For now, India was a kaleidoscope of competing powers, each sharpening its ambitions in the glow of iron furnaces and temple fires. Urban life was back. Fortified towns grew around the royal courts, surrounded by walls of baked brick and moats glistening in the heat. Merchants and craftsmen clustered in market districts, their stalls heavy with bronze wares beads and textiles. The sound of trade replaced the chant of ritual, clinking coins, haggling voices, the creak of ox carts. For the first time in Indian history, money appeared in the form of punch-marked silver coins, each stamped with a constellation of tiny symbols: fish trees, wheels, suns. These little bits of metal transformed everything. Trade routes spread like arteries across the subcontinent. Goods flowed not only between cities, but across regions reaching as far as Persia and Central Asia. Ivory from the forests, spices from the coasts, silk and horses from the northwest, all passed through the hands of Indian merchants who were learning that prosperity could be minted. With wealth came complexity. Towns drew artisans, traders, and thinkers from every direction. Guilds emerged, organized associations of craftsmen who set standards, protected members, and sometimes acted as miniature governments of their own. A potter or weaver could now find security not in lineage, but in profession. The social fabric was fraying and reweaving itself into new patterns, and the old Vedic certainties, birth ritual hierarchy, were no longer enough to explain this new world of movement and money. Even religion began to feel tired. The elaborate fire sacrifices that had once been the centerpiece of faith now seemed wasteful to merchants who counted profits and kings who counted armies. Priests chanted longer and louder, but the people were starting to look elsewhere for meaning. In the growing cities, new questions burned brighter than the ritual fires. What is the point of all this sacrifice? Why must birth determine one's worth? If the soul is eternal, what is freedom? Out in the forests, the old hermit's legacy lived on in wandering thinkers, shramanas, seekers, who rejected wealth caste and ritual altogether. They fasted, debated, and meditated beneath trees, teaching that liberation didn't require gold or fire, only awareness. These outsiders, some serene, some severe, were the intellectual rebels of their age. To the Brahmins, they were troublemakers. To the restless townsfolk, they were prophets. Meanwhile, in the cities, politics had grown sophisticated. Monarchs ruled through bureaucracy. Ministers advised on law, trade, and warfare. Tax collectors roamed the villages. Armies swelled, now equipped with iron weapons and disciplined ranks of soldiers rather than tribal militias. Horses and elephants thundered across the plains, symbols of royal might and divine favor. Kings performed the Ashvamedha, the great horse sacrifice, to proclaim their dominance. But the act had become more theater than theology, a spectacle of power, not piety. The Brahmins presided with solemn chants, yet the true drama unfolded outside the ritual grounds, where armies marched and kingdoms plotted. As competition intensified, alliances formed and broke like waves. Kosala, centered around Ayodhya, often clashed with Magadha to the east. Avanti, in the west, grew wealthy from trade routes that linked India to Persia. Vatsa, with its capital at Kausambi, became a hub of commerce and diplomacy. Each realm saw itself as destined to rule the rest, and each invested heavily in temples, fortifications, and political intrigue to prove it. And yet, amid all this expansion and ambition, the atmosphere of unease deepened. The rituals that once held society together now seemed mechanical. Priests had become bureaucrats of the sacred. The questions born in the Upanishadic forests began to trickle into the cities. Merchants, nobles, and commoners alike found themselves asking, if knowledge can liberate, why not seek it ourselves? If truth lives in the heart, why pay a priest to chant it for us? It was a quiet revolution, brewing beneath the noise of the markets. For the first time since the days of the Indus, India was urban again. Yet it was a different kind of urbanism, restless and self-aware. The towns glowed at night with oil lamps and smelled of cooked rice and iron smoke. Philosophers debated under banyan trees. Kings consulted astrologers before battle. Monks walked barefoot from city to city, spreading new ideas like seeds on the wind. This was a civilization poised between two worlds, the ritual and the rational, the sacred and the civic. Its rulers sought conquest, its traders sought profit, and its thinkers sought truth. Out of that triangle of ambition, wealth and doubt would soon rise two of history's most enduring paths, the gentle enlightenment of the Buddha and the fierce renunciation of Mahavira. By the 6th century, BCE, India's plains were humming iron furnaces, glowing red cities, teeming with merchant scholars and wandering priests. The Mahajanapadas competed in splendor and ambition. Kings measured greatness in elephants and coins. Yet beneath this fever of progress ran a quiet exhaustion. The old rituals had become heavy with procedure and expense. To feed the fire altars, kings poured rivers of wealth into ceremonies whose meanings few still understood. Priests recited hymns so vast they required entire schools to memorize them. But the question that had haunted the forest philosophers still lingered. Could any of this truly bring freedom? A new current began to flow against that tide, one that would reshape the spiritual map of Asia. Across the kingdoms, men and women began to turn away from palaces and ritual fires to seek truth on their own terms. They were called Shramanas, strivers, from the root shram, meaning effort. They strove not for wealth or ritual perfection, but for liberation moksha. The Shramana movement was not one creed, but a mosaic of rebels. Some practiced severe austerity, others meditation or debate. Some believed the soul was eternal, others that there was none at all. But they shared one conviction: salvation was personal, experiential, and could not be bought with sacrifice or birthright. In an age of kings and hierarchies, that idea was revolutionary. Picture the cities of the Ganges, plain Rajagriha, Vaishali Kausambi, buzzing with merchants and monks, with philosophers arguing under banyan trees, while the smell of spiced grain drifted from the markets. These were not sterile academies. They were living laboratories of thought. Dozens of teachers, each proclaiming the path to truth, traveled barefoot from town to town. Some taught strict asceticism, others radical materialism, some the doctrine of karma and rebirth, others the futility of both. India, once the land of hymns, had become the land of debate. Out of this ferment rose two figures destined to change not only India, but the moral vocabulary of humanity: Siddhartha, Gautama, the Buddha, and Vardhamana Mahavira, the Jina, the conqueror of self. Both were born princes, heirs to privilege. Both looked upon their gilded worlds and found them hollow. And both walked away. Siddhartha was born in the Shakya clan near the foothills of the Himalayas, modern-day Nepal, around the mid-6th century BCE. His father, a regional king, shielded him from the sight of suffering. The palace was paradise-perfumed gardens, music-fine foods, but perfection can be its own prison. One day, slipping beyond the gates, he encountered what the scriptures later called the four sights: an old man, a sick man, a corpse, and a wandering ascetic. In that moment, the prince understood the law of life. Dukkha, suffering, touches all. He left his home, his wife, and his infant son, exchanging silks for a beggar's robe. For years he sought truth among teachers and ascetics, mastering meditation, starving his body, seeking wisdom through pain. But enlightenment didn't come. One night, weakened but resolute, he sat beneath a fig tree in Bodh Gaya and vowed not to rise until he understood. By dawn, the prince had become the Buddha, the awakened one. What he saw was disarmingly simple: life is suffering. Suffering is born of desire. Desire can end, and there is a path to end it, the middle way, avoiding the extremes of indulgence and self-torture. The Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path: right view, right action, right speech, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, right intention, a guide not to heaven, but to awakening. He founded no temple, claimed no divinity. He spoke in the common dialect, not Sanskrit. He invited anyone noble, or peasant man, or woman, high caste or outcast, to walk beside him. His community of monks and nuns, the Sangha, lived by alms and discipline, carrying the message of compassion and mindfulness across the plains. For the first time, the path to salvation was democratized. While the Buddha preached the end of craving, another prince was perfecting a different ideal: the conquest of violence itself. Vardhamana Mahavira, a born in the Naya clan of the Vaishali region, was a contemporary of the Buddha, perhaps slightly older. Like Siddhartha, he renounced luxury in search of truth, but his path was one of extreme austerity. For 12 years, he wandered naked and barefoot, enduring hunger, ridicule, and pain, until through absolute detachment, he attained Kevalajnana, complete knowledge. Thereafter, he was called Mahavira, the great hero, the 24th and final Tirthankara spiritual guide of the Jain tradition. Mahavira taught that the soul jiva is bound to the cycle of birth and death by karma, a fine material substance generated by harmful actions. Liberation comes not through ritual or grace, but through purifying the soul by ethical conduct and ascetic discipline. His central doctrine was ahimsa nonviolence, not merely toward humans, but toward every living being, down to the smallest insect. To harm another was to harm oneself. For Jains, compassion meant more than sentiment. It was practiced vegetarianism, honesty, non-possession, and restraint. Monks swept the ground before them to avoid stepping on tiny creatures, and even lay followers adopted vows of moderation and kindness. In a world where kingdoms rose on conquest, this quiet revolution of harmlessness was extraordinary. Both Buddhism and Jainism challenged the hierarchy of the Brahmins. They rejected the authority of the Vedas, the caste system, and the notion that salvation was a hereditary privilege. They offered instead a human-scaled path, self-knowledge, ethical living, and awareness. The Buddha's path was the middle road, gentle and pragmatic. Mahavira's was severe, heroic, uncompromising. Yet both met at the same horizon, the liberation of the self from desire and cruelty. Their teachings spread like wildfire through the growing cities. Monasteries rose near trade routes, supported by merchants who found in these faiths a moral code that matched their worldly lives. No blood sacrifice, no caste barrier, no demand for costly rituals. In this new moral economy, generosity replaced offerings and meditation replaced fire. Imagine the contrast on one side, the booming voice of a priest calling for another ritual, another fee. On the other, a calm monk under a tree, saying softly, "All beings fear pain. See yourself in them." The first promised heaven through obedience. The second offered peace through understanding. For many, the choice was clear. Kings too listened. Some, like Bimbisara of Magadha and Prasenajit of Kosala, supported the new teachers out of curiosity, conscience, or political strategy. The great cities became crossroads of spiritual traffic. Debates between monks, Jains, and Brahmins filled the air like verbal fireworks. The Shramana movement had begun as a murmur of discontent. Now it was a symphony of alternatives, a chorus questioning everything from the authority of priests to the meaning of existence itself. India was awakening again, not in firelight, but in mindfulness, not through conquest, but through compassion. The restless kingdom of the Ganges had produced more than iron and trade. It had produced an idea that truth is not inherited, but discovered within. And somewhere in the shade of the Bodhi tree, a man who had once been a prince smiled quietly, knowing that his awakening was only the beginning. Across the northern plains, where trade routes shimmered like spider silk under the sun, two figures began to walk barefoot, each carrying only a bowl and a vision. One was called the Awakened One, the other the Great Victor. The world would remember them as the Buddha and the Jina, or Mahavira. They were born in the same restless age, spoke the same languages, breathed the same monsoon air, and between them, they redrew the map of the Indian soul. Siddhartha Gautama. The Buddha had been a man of privilege. As a young prince of the Shakya clan, he had lived surrounded by music perfumes and silks carefully shielded from the sight of sorrow. Yet no wall, however high, can keep out truth forever. One day, slipping beyond his father's palace, he saw an old man stooped in pain, a sick man gasping for breath, a corpse still as stone, and finally a wandering ascetic whose face shone with serenity. In that instant, the veil of luxury tore. He left his home in the night, exchanging princely ornaments for a beggar's robe. For years he wandered across the Ganges plain, studying with renowned teachers, meditating under trees, fasting to the brink of death. But enlightenment, the peace that endures, eluded him. Finally, in a grove near a village called Bodh Gaya, he sat beneath a fig tree and resolved not to rise until he understood the nature of suffering. The night was long. Memories, temptations, fears all came and went like passing storms. As dawn broke, the young man saw not a vision, but a realization. Life's suffering is born from craving. Freedom lies in letting go. That morning, Siddhartha became the Buddha, the awakened one. What he discovered, he said, was not a revelation, but a recognition, the Four Noble Truths. 1. Existence is marked by suffering dukkha. 2. Suffering arises from desire. 3. There is an end to suffering. 4. That end is reached by following the Eightfold Path: right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. It was a path of moderation, the middle way, avoiding both self-indulgence and self-mortification. One could not bully the soul into enlightenment. One must simply see clearly. The Buddha gathered disciples, farmers, kings, merchants, outcasts, and women, and formed a community, the Sangha. They lived simply moving from village to village, preaching compassion, wisdom, and mindfulness. In a world ruled by ritual, the Buddha spoke in the language of reason. Just as a goldsmith tests gold by burning and cutting, he told his followers, "So should you examine my words, not in faith, but through experience." His teachings spread along trade routes and rivers. The merchant class, rising in power, but burdened by ritual taxes, found in Buddhism a religion of ethics rather than ceremony. To give alms, to live honestly, to avoid cruelty, these were acts of merit more meaningful than any costly sacrifice. Kings found comfort in its moderation, peasants in its fairness, and women in its inclusivity. The Buddha traveled for 45 years teaching across the Gangetic plains. His presence was gentle yet transformative. Where others promised heaven, he offered insight. Where others demanded devotion, he encouraged understanding. When he died at Kushinagara, lying between two sal trees, he told his followers, "All compounded things are impermanent. Strive on with diligence." But his death was not an ending. The Buddha's words, passed down orally for generations, became the foundation of a vast spiritual civilization. Meanwhile, in another kingdom, not far away, another prince was walking a harder road. Vardhamana Mahavira, born to a noble family of the Naya clan, grew up surrounded by the comforts of status. Yet, like Siddhartha, he too felt a fire within, an unease that neither wealth nor ritual could extinguish. At age 30, he renounced the world, abandoning his home possessions and clothing. For the next 12 years, he wandered as an ascetic, silent barefoot, and nearly naked, seeking liberation through discipline and detachment. Where the Buddha chose the middle path, Mahavira chose the razor's edge. He endured heat, hunger, and ridicule, meditating through pain until under a sal tree near the river Rijupalika, he attained Kevala, infinite knowledge and perception. He had conquered desire, ego, and fear. He was now the Jina, the victor, and his followers became known as Jains. Mahavira's insight was as radical as the Buddha's was compassionate. He taught that every living being, from human to ant to microbe, possesses a soul jiva, luminous and eternal. These souls are trapped in matter through the weight of karma, which is not metaphorical, but real, a fine, sticky substance produced by ignorance and violence. Liberation comes by shedding this karmic dust through strict ethical living meditation and renunciation. At the core of his teaching were the 5 great vows, Mahavratas. 1. Ahimsa, nonviolence toward all beings. 2. Satya, truthfulness. 3. Asteya, non-stealing. 4. Brahmacharya, chastity. 5. Aparigraha, non-possession. The first of these, ahimsa, became the heartbeat of Jainism, and in time of Indian civilization itself. To harm even the smallest creature was to harm one's own soul. Jain monks swept the ground before them to avoid stepping on insect-strained water through cloth to save unseen life, and ate only what was freely given. Their discipline was severe, but their moral vision was luminous. Like the Buddha, Mahavira inspired not only monks, but lay followers, merchants, artisans, and householders who supported the ascetics with food and donations, practicing the same virtues in daily life. Jain communities flourished in trade-rich cities where non-violence and honesty became marks of integrity and trust. Though their doctrines differed, Buddhism and Jainism shared a revolutionary idea that truth was not the monopoly of birth or ritual, but the right of every conscious being. Salvation was no longer an inheritance, it was an effort. As the generations passed, monasteries and viharas sprang up across the land. Built near trade routes and fertile villages, these centers became sanctuaries of both spirit and intellect. They offered shelter to travelers, education to the curious, and compassion to the weary. From them, monks set out in all directions, some north toward the Himalayas, others south into the Deccan. Merchants carried the teachings with their goods. Alongside ivory and spices, they traded ideas, the Buddha's sermons, the Jina's vows. Caravans moving through the passes of Gandhara took them west toward Central Asia. In return, new influences arrived, Greek art, Persian motifs, foreign tongues all blending into the evolving Indian mosaic. The spiritual transformation that swept India during this period was profound. The fire sacrifices of the Brahmins, once the heart of religious life, began to wane. The sound of Vedic chants gave way to the stillness of meditation halls and the soft shuffle of monks' robes. The gods of the sky were not denied, but they were no longer the only voices in the cosmic choir. For the first time, morality stood apart from theology. The Buddha's doctrine of compassion and Mahavira's doctrine of restraint became twin pillars of a new moral consciousness. They redefined what it meant to live ethically, not to obey, but to awaken, not to dominate, but to refrain. From the palace gates of Kapilavastu to the marketplaces of Pataliputra, from the monsoon forests of Bihar to the caves of the Western Ghats, India was changing. The age of sacrifice had given way to the age of self-realization. As the Buddha's monks wandered barefoot across the plains and Mahavira's ascetics swept the paths before them, a different kind of movement stirred in the heart of northern India, less spiritual, more strategic. Beneath the hymns and meditations, the drums of empire were beginning to sound. Among the 16 Mahajanapadas, one kingdom was quietly rising above the rest. Its name was Magadha, a lush, iron-rich land nestled in the lower Ganges Valley, in what is now Bihar. Its fertile soil fed armies. Its rivers served as trade routes. Its forests yielded elephants for war. In an age where geography was destiny, Magadha had been dealt a royal flush. Early rulers like Bimbisara and Ajatashatru had already begun transforming Magadha from a regional power into a formidable state. They fortified their capital at Rajagriha, then later Pataliputra, a city destined to become one of the greatest in ancient Asia. Massive timber walls surrounded its streets, watchtowers guarded its gates, and the Ganges curved protectively around its perimeter like a moat of destiny. By the 4th century BCE, the throne of Magadha had passed into the hands of the Nanda dynasty, and under them, the kingdom became a machine. The Nandas were not born of noble lineage, at least not according to their critics. Later, Brahmanical sources, often written by offended elites, sneered that the first Nanda king, Mahapadmananda, was the son of a barber, and a queen, a man of low birth, who had clawed his way to power through cunning and ambition. Whether true or not, the insult reveals something important. The Nandas broke tradition. They ruled not by divine right, but by efficiency, wealth, and bureaucracy. Mahapadmananda was called Ekarat, the sole sovereign. He waged relentless campaigns, swallowing neighboring states one by one. Under his rule, Magadha extended its reach across much of northern India, building a network of provinces governed by loyal officials. He levied taxes on nearly everything: land crops, crafts water, even prostitution. The people groaned, the treasury swelled, and Magadha's power became unshakable. Ancient Greek accounts written by historians who later followed Alexander the Great described the Nanda army in tones of awe. They spoke of a force so vast it sounded almost mythical: 200,000 infantry, 20,000 cavalry, 2,000 chariots, and 3,000 war elephants. Even if those numbers were inflated, as they almost certainly were, the message was clear: Magadha had become a military colossus. The Nandas ruled through fear and calculation. Their bureaucracy was efficient, their spies numerous, their tax collectors relentless. But for all their might, they lacked something: intangible legitimacy. The Brahmins despised them for their disregard of ritual. The people resented their greed, yet none dared challenge them. Not until a young man named Chandragupta would later rise from the margins. But that was still a few decades away. Meanwhile, far to the northwest, the Indian frontier trembled under the march of another unstoppable force, one that came not from the Ganges, but from Macedon. In 327 BCE, Alexander the Great, having conquered Persia, turned his gaze east toward the mysterious land known to the Greeks as Indus. He crossed the Hindu Kush with his battle-hardened army, entering the Indus Valley, a region that had once been home to Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, now ruled by small kingdoms and tribal republics. For the first time, the civilizations of India and the Mediterranean met face to face, not as traders, but as conqueror and conquered. Alexander's campaign into India was brief but thunderous. He fought local rulers, most famously King Puru, known to the Greeks as Porus, on the banks of the Hydaspes River, the modern Jhelum. The battle was fierce: elephants charging into phalanxes, arrows darkening the sky, soldiers locked in mud and blood. Porus, though defeated, fought so valiantly that even Alexander was moved. When asked how he wished to be treated, Porus replied simply, "As a king treats a king." Alexander, impressed, restored him to power. But the victory came at a cost. Alexander's army, exhausted by years of conquest and terrified by tales of the gigantic Nanda army to the east, refused to go further. Standing at the banks of the Beas River, the conqueror faced his first mutiny. The dream of reaching the Ganges died, there drowned in fatigue and rebellion. The great Macedonian turned back, leaving behind a trail of garrisons and a legacy of disruption. His invasion was like a thunderstorm, brief, violent, and cleansing. When it passed, the northwest was left fractured and uncertain. Local satraps squabbled for power. Greek settlers mingled uneasily with Indian rulers. For India, the shock was brief but seismic. The subcontinent had glimpsed for the first time the machinery of empire, and realized that it could build one of its own. The ripple of Alexander's retreat traveled eastward, carried on the whispers of merchants and envoys, tales of strange armor, foreign tactics, and a world far beyond the mountains. In the corridors of Pataliputra, such stories would not have been ignored. The Nandas understood that India was no longer an island. Beyond its borders, new powers were rising. Inside India, too, the political climate was shifting. The spread of Buddhism and Jainism had eroded the old priestly order, and ideas of ethics, law, and governance were evolving. Monarchs were no longer seen merely as ritual patrons, but as guardians of Dharma, the moral order of the world. The concept of the righteous ruler, the Dharmaraja, was taking root. It was in this crucible of pressure from within and without that the foundation for the Mauryan Empire was quietly being forged. The Nandas, for all their unpopularity, had created the infrastructure taxation bureaucracy and a centralized army. Alexander's invasion had cracked open the door to a wider world, revealing both danger and opportunity. And somewhere in the shadows of Magadha's immense bureaucracy, a disillusioned scholar named Chanakya, or Kautilya, was watching, waiting, and planning. The Nandas had built a fortress of iron and gold, but every fortress, no matter how formidable, eventually finds its breach. In this case, it came not from armies or rebellion, but from an idea carried by two men as different as fire and flint, a disillusioned scholar and a hungry young warrior. Together, they would create the first empire of India. The scholar was Chanakya, also known by his pen name Kautilya, or Vishnugupta, depending on which chronicle you read. He was a Brahmin from the north, brilliant, sharp-tongued, and utterly intolerant of incompetence. Legend says he once served at the Nanda court in Pataliputra, and was so insulted by the king's arrogance that he swore revenge, vowing not to tie his top knot until the dynasty was destroyed. You could say he invented the academic grudge match. The young warrior he found was Chandragupta Maurya, a man of obscure origins, perhaps born of a humble clan from Magadha or Punjab. What mattered was not his birth, but his ambition. Chanakya saw in him the steel of leadership and the flexibility of youth, the perfect vessel for his vision. In their partnership, intellect and instinct fused. The philosopher became the strategist, the soldier, the sword. Their campaign began in whispers. Chanakya, master of intrigue, understood that empires are not toppled by strength alone, but by information. He built a network of spies, couriers, and agents who moved through markets and palaces alike, merchants by day, informants by night. The Arthashastra, the great treatise attributed to him, later codified this web of governance. It is one of the most startling documents of the ancient world, part political manual, part moral labyrinth. Where the Bhagavad Gita teaches duty, the Arthashastra teaches power, how to wield it, how to keep it, and how to survive it. It describes espionage, taxation law, economics, and even the art of seduction as instruments of statecraft. The king, it says, shall lose no time when the opportunity to attack arises. Machiavelli, writing nearly 2 millennia later, would have found in Chanakya a kindred spirit with better spies and fewer scruples. Through cunning and patience, the pair chipped away at Nanda control. Chandragupta rallied discontented generals, forged alliances among smaller kingdoms, and waged guerrilla warfare from the frontiers. The people, weary of Nanda greed, rallied to him. The revolution was not a single battle, but a series of strokes, each cutting deeper into the roots of tyranny. When the final blow came, the Nandas collapsed under their own weight. The treasury that had once oppressed the people now filled Chandragupta's coffers. The streets of Pataliputra, that wooden marvel along the Ganges, belonged to a new ruler. The Mauryan Empire was born. At its height, it would stretch farther than any Indian kingdom before it, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the edge of Bengal, from the Deccan Plains to the Himalayas. For the first time in recorded history, much of the subcontinent answered to a single crown. But Chandragupta was not merely a conqueror. He was an administrator. Guided by Chanakya's counsel, he built a bureaucracy so intricate it could rival any in the ancient world. The empire was divided into provinces, each ruled by governors, often members of the royal family. Below them, officials oversaw districts, villages, and guilds. Taxes were collected in grain, gold, and labor. Inspectors ensured markets were fair weights, honest, and crops sufficient. Spies, oh the spies, watched everyone, including each other. The state was everywhere invisible, but absolute. At Pataliputra, the capital, life pulsed with organized precision. Greek envoys who visited like Megasthenes' ambassador to Chandragupta from the Seleucid court described a city of astonishing scale-wide streets, symmetrical layout, wooden palisades, and 570 towers rising over the walls. Bureaucrats kept meticulous records. Scribes documented every trade, every birth, every rumor. It was civilization, as surveillance, efficient, effective, and exhausting. And always there were elephants. Thousands of them, trained and armored, formed the beating heart of the Mauryan army. To foreign observers, they were terrifying the tanks of antiquity. Each carried a tower with archers and spearmen. Their trumpets echoed like war drums. Alongside them marched infantry cavalry and chariots disciplined and deadly. Chandragupta's foreign policy was as bold as his warfare. In the northwest, he faced the newly fractured remnants of Alexander's empire, now ruled by Seleucus III Nicator, one of the conqueror's generals. Around 305 BCE, Seleucus attempted to reclaim the Indian territories once held by Alexander. The result was a clash between two great strategists, one Greek, one Indian. Accounts differ on who won, but the peace that followed speaks for itself. Seleucus ceded his eastern provinces to Chandragupta territories, including modern Afghanistan and Baluchistan, in exchange for 500 war elephants. Those elephants would later help Seleucus win battles in the west, while India gained control of the mountain passes and trade routes that linked it to Persia and beyond. To seal the alliance, Chandragupta married a Greek princess, perhaps Seleucus's daughter, and welcomed Greek envoys to his court. Pataliputra, already cosmopolitan, now became a crossroads of cultures. Ideas, art, and mathematics flowed in both directions, carried on the backs of diplomats and traders. Yet for all his power, Chandragupta's story ends not with conquest, but with renunciation, a fitting echo of his age. In his later years, influenced perhaps by the teachings of Jain monks, he abdicated the throne, leaving the empire to his son Bindusara. According to tradition, he journeyed south to Karnataka, where he lived as an ascetic, fasting until death, beneath a cave, an emperor returning to silence. History remembers him less vividly than Alexander, less morally than Ashoka, but perhaps more consequentially than either. He built the infrastructure of Indian statehood, a model of administration and empire that would echo through the centuries. The Mauryan machine would outlive him, perfected and moralized by his grandson. And in the quiet chambers of Pataliputra, where scribes once copied his decrees, the wind still seems to carry the whisper of Chanakya's credo, "A ruler is not born. He is made by discipline, by wisdom, and by the patience to wait for the right moment to strike." When Chandragupta's grandson, Ashoka, inherited the Mauryan throne around 268 BCE, the empire was already vast, stretching from the Hindu Kush to the Bay of Bengal, from the Himalayas to the Narmada River. It was efficient, bureaucratic, and terrifyingly organized. But under Ashoka, it would become something greater, still a mirror of the human soul, brilliant, ambitious, and capable of guilt. At first, there was no hint of remorse in him. Ashoka was a conqueror, born into empire and trained in ruthlessness. Legends say that his early path to power was drenched in blood, that he crushed rivals, brothers, and rebels alike to secure the throne of Pataliputra. Whether those tales are exaggerations or political slander, they capture a truth. Ashoka was not gentle by nature. He was forged in the iron furnace of empire. And yet destiny loves irony. The man who began as one of India's most ruthless rulers would become one of its most compassionate. The turning point came 8 years into his reign, when Ashoka turned his eyes eastward toward Kalinga, a prosperous coastal kingdom on the shores of the Bay of Bengal in modern Odisha. Kalinga had long resisted Mauryan control. It stood as a symbol of independence, a challenge to imperial pride. Ashoka's armies marched in with elephants and steel, confident of easy victory. What followed was slaughter. Contemporary inscriptions tell us that 100,000 people were killed and 150,000 were deported, a staggering toll even by ancient standards. When the battle was over, the fields of Kalinga were said to have run red with blood, the rivers clogged with corpses. The victors walked in silence, surrounded by the stench of death. And somewhere amid the carnage, Ashoka's soul broke. He walked the battlefield, not as a victor, but as a witness to mothers wailing to orphans, searching for their fathers, to the emptiness of conquest. He later inscribed his own confession for all to read. On conquering Kalinga, the beloved of the gods felt remorse. For when an independent country is conquered, the slaughter, death, and deportation of the people is extremely grievous to the beloved of the gods. This was not propaganda. It was repentance carved into rock. The emperor had conquered a kingdom, only to find himself conquered by conscience. In the aftermath, Ashoka embraced Buddhism, a faith that had once been the refuge of wandering monks and merchants, and now found a patron in the most powerful man on earth. He renounced aggressive warfare, calling his new policy Dhamma Vijaya, the conquest by righteousness. Instead of sending armies, he sent emissaries of peace. Instead of fortresses, he built monasteries and hospitals. The transformation was so complete that later generations struggled to believe it. Could an emperor truly rule by compassion? Ashoka proved that he could at least try. His edicts, carved on rocks and polished stone pillars across the empire, became one of the earliest and most ambitious public communications in history. Written in local languages, from Prakrit to Greek and Aramaic, they spoke directly to the people, farmers, merchants, soldiers, monks. There was no priestly mediation, no secret scripture, just the voice of a ruler, clear and human, etched into stone. All men are my children. What I desire for my own children, I desire for all men. He called himself not King of Kings or Lord of the world, but simply Devanampiya Piyadasi, beloved of the gods, he who looks with affection. The Dharma he preached was not strictly Buddhist. It was broader, a moral code, blending compassion, tolerance, and self-restraint. It forbade needless animal slaughter, encouraged respect among faiths, urged officials to be honest, and promoted welfare for humans and animals alike. Pillars were erected near highways, with shade trees and wells for travelers. Hospitals and rest houses were built. Even prisoners were granted reprieves during festivals. To enforce this moral order, Ashoka appointed officials called Dhamma Mahamatras, officers of righteousness, whose job was not to collect taxes or command troops, but to spread virtue, mediate disputes, and protect the vulnerable. Bureaucracy had turned ethical. And yet the empire did not grow weak. Its administration remained efficient, its roads safe, its borders secure. The army still stood ready, but its purpose had shifted from conquest to protection. The Ashokan Age was also one of extraordinary cultural flowering. Stone architecture replaced timber. Artisans carved the great lion capitals of the Ashokan pillars, polished sandstone monoliths that gleamed like bronze in the sun. The most famous at Sarnath, with its 4 lions facing the cardinal directions, would one day become India's national emblem. Monks carried the Dharma beyond India's frontiers, supported by the emperor's patronage. Ashoka's own inscriptions record that he sent envoys to the Hellenistic world, to Egypt, Syria, and Greece, as well as to Sri Lanka, Central Asia, and the Himalayas. Some of those missions took root, others faded. But the idea was unprecedented, a ruler spreading peace instead of war. Of course, even compassion has its limits. Not everyone welcomed Ashoka's moral crusade. Some nobles and generals chafed under his policies. Some subjects may have found his moral lectures intrusive. The empire's unity, held together by will and bureaucracy, began to strain at its edges. But none could deny the sincerity or magnitude of his transformation. He had inherited the sword of empire and laid it down for a staff of mercy. In the world's long history of rulers, that alone makes him luminous. When Ashoka died around 232 BCE, the empire began to fragment, but his message endured, carved into cliffs, echoed in monasteries, remembered in legend. Centuries later, when explorers rediscovered his inscriptions, the world learned again of the king who had spoken across millennia through stone. Ashoka's reign marked a rare moment when power bowed to conscience, when a ruler tried to replace fear with empathy and policy with principle. His pillars still stand, weathered but unbroken, scattered across the plains of India like sentinels of a forgotten golden age. And if you listen closely, the stone still whispers, "Even the conqueror can be conquered by compassion." Empires rarely die in explosions. They fade quietly, like the embers of a once great fire glowing faintly before turning to ash. So it was with the Mauryan Empire. When Ashoka died around 232 BCE, his vision of rule through compassion had reached across the subcontinent, but his heirs lacked both his genius and his moral gravity. The empire he had held together with stone and conscience began to drift apart piece by piece. His successors, Dasharatha Samprati, and others now largely forgotten, sat on a throne that seemed to grow larger as their authority shrank. Provinces asserted independence, governors turned kings, and generals carved out personal realms. The machinery of the Mauryan bureaucracy, so intricate under Chanakya and Ashoka, was too heavy to run without a master mechanic. By the mid-2nd century BCE, the once mighty Mauryan unity had dissolved into a patchwork of regional powers. Yet from those fragments came a new kind of India, not an empire, but a mosaic. In the north, the Shunga dynasty rose from the ashes. Founded by Pushyamitra Shunga, a Brahmin general who overthrew the last Mauryan ruler, the Shungas reasserted the vigor of traditional religion and court ritual. Their rule centered around Pataliputra, and later Vidisha, lasted a century and a half. Under them, Sanskrit poetry revived, and the grand stupas of Bharhut and Sanchi were expanded with ornate carving scenes from the Jatakas and the Buddha's life, rendered with delicacy and devotion. But beyond their walls, the world was shifting. Across India's borders, Greek and Central Asian powers pressed inward, drawn by trade and the vacuum of empire. To the northwest, the remnants of Alexander's legacy still flickered. In Bactria, modern Afghanistan, a line of Hellenistic kings ruled over Greek-speaking cities ringed by Indian culture. They minted coins with bilingual inscriptions, Greek on one side, Prakrit or Kharosthi on the other. A few even bore the image of Indian deities beside Zeus and Athena. The most famous among them, Menander, known in Indian sources as Milinda, would later earn immortality, not through conquest, but through conversation. A Buddhist monk named Nagasena debated Menander in a dialogue recorded as the Milindapanya, the questions of King Milinda. The Greek asked with razor-sharp logic, if there is no permanent self who attains enlightenment, the monk smiled and replied, as the chariot is nothing but its parts, so is the self, nothing but the coming together of causes. The king was said to have bowed his head, converted to Buddhism, and renounced his crown. Whether myth or truth, the story captures the spirit of this age where ideas traveled as freely as armies. From Bactria, waves of Indo-Greek rulers swept into the Punjab and the Ganges plains, bringing with them not domination but dialogue. Their influence mingled with Indian tradition to create something new, the Gandhara civilization. In the valleys of modern Pakistan and Afghanistan, artisans began to carve the image of the Buddha not as a symbol, but as a person, draped in flowing Greco-Roman robes, serene and human. He gazed down with compassion from stone niches. The face was Indian, the folds of the robe, Greek, the philosophy, universal. It was here, in these hybrid studios of Gandhara, that the first human depictions of the Buddha were born, an extraordinary fusion of East and West, of faith and form. The Indo-Greeks were soon followed by other waves of outsiders, Scythians, Shakas, from the Central Asian steppes, and later the Parthians and Kushans, each absorbing, adapting, and adding to India's cultural fabric. In the south, another power was rising, the Satavahanas. Centered in the Deccan, their realm bridged north and south, controlling key trade routes between the Ganges Valley and the western ports. They ruled from Pratisthana, modern Python minted coins in local dialects, and proudly styled themselves as defenders of Dharma. Under them, commerce flourished. Merchants sailed from Indian ports to the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, even Roman Egypt. If the Mauryas had unified India by conquest, the Satavahanas reconnected it by commerce. Ships loaded with pepper pearls, ivory, and textiles left the harbors of Paraksopara and Arikamedu. In return came Roman gold wine glassware and amphorae. Alongside these goods came ideas, Greek astronomy, Persian art, and Buddhist philosophy spreading in both directions. In cave monasteries cut into the western Ghats, Ajanta Karla Nasik traders and monks shared space wealth and faith. Their donations carved into stone pillars testify to a society where material and spiritual economies intertwined. A merchant could fund a stupa and a ship in the same lifetime. Back in the north, coins from this period tell stories of mingling worlds. Athena, with a trident Indian elephants, next to Greek helmets, inscriptions in Greek and Brahmi. On the trade routes linking Mathura, Taxila, and Ujjain, one could hear a dozen tongues, Greek, Prakrit, Persian Tamil, and Sanskrit mixing in the dust. It was an age of connection, not isolation. And while no single empire commanded all of India, there was a shared pulse, a rhythm of trade tolerance and transformation. Religion too evolved. Buddhism spread across the subcontinent and beyond, while Hinduism, rejuvenated by local traditions, began to absorb the language of devotion and art. The Mauryan dream of unity was gone, but its spirit endured in new forms. Instead of a single ruler, there was a civilizational conversation. Instead of one capital, 100 centers of art, learning, and trade. From Taxila in the north to Madurai in the south, India had become a vast cultural corridor, a world of porous borders and borrowed gods. It was in every sense a frontier, age not of walls, but of bridges. The lion capital of Ashoka stood weathered yet unforgotten, and the whisper of Dharma traveled along the silk routes as surely as the spice caravans. Out of the ruins of empire, India had rediscovered something older and deeper then central rule, the ability to absorb, adapt, and renew. If the fall of the Mauryas had splintered India into a mosaic, then the centuries that followed turned that mosaic into a kaleidoscope color culture and conquest, constantly shifting under the light of new arrivals. The Northwest, that ancient gateway between India and the world, became a crossroads of civilizations, a living experiment in what happens when Greeks, Persians, Scythians, and Indians all share the same horizon. Picture the cities of Taxila and Gandhara around the 2nd century BCE. Marble columns in the Greek style rise beside Buddhist stupas. Persian motifs weave through Indian textiles. Traders from the Mediterranean haggle with monks in saffron robes. The air is heavy with the scent of frankincense, olive oil, and wet clay from sculptors' studios. It was a world without clear borders, cosmopolitan before the word existed. At the center of this cultural crossroads stood the Indo-Greek kings, the heirs of Alexander's Eastern dream. Though their power waxed and waned, their legacy was vast. The most renowned among them was Menander, known in Indian lore as Milinda, who ruled from Sagala, modern Sialkot, around 160 BCE. He was no mere conqueror, he was a philosopher in armor. The Buddhist text, Milindapanya, The Questions of King Milinda, immortalizes a dialogue between the king and the monk Nagasena. The king, trained in Greek logic, challenges the monk with razor-edged reasoning. If there is no self, Nagasena, then who is it that attains enlightenment? Who receives karma's fruit? Who is reborn? Nagasena answers with calm precision. He asks the king to describe his chariot. Is the chariot the wheel, the axle, the seat, the reins? When the parts are taken apart, the chariot disappears. So, it is with the self. He says it is a collection of elements ever changing. Menander listens, questions, and according to tradition, smiles in enlightenment. He is said to have laid down his crown and joined the order of monks. Whether that story is history or allegory, it captures a profound truth. The meeting of Greece and India was not a clash, but a conversation. The Greeks brought realism and reason. India offered metaphysics and mystery. Together, they sculpted something new, literally sculpted. In the workshops of Gandhara, artists began to carve the first human images of the Buddha. Before this era, Buddhist art had avoided depicting the enlightened one in human form, representing him through symbols. Instead, a wheel, a tree, a footprint. But under the influence of Hellenistic naturalism, sculptors gave the Buddha a body calm, idealized, and profoundly human. He appeared with wavy hair, serene eyes, and draped robes reminiscent of Apollo or a Roman philosopher. The result was transcendent yet familiar, a fusion of Indian spirituality and Greek aesthetics. This was the birth of Gandhara art, one of history's most graceful marriages of East and West. While the Greeks shaped philosophy and formed new powers were gathering on the steppes beyond the Hindu Kush, the Shakas, or Scythians, nomadic warriors from Central Asia. They swept into India around the 1st century BCE, filling the void left by the fading Indo-Greek realms. They ruled parts of western India from cities like Ujjain and Mathura, adopting Indian titles and customs, even as they carried the swagger of the steppes. Among their most famous rulers was Rudradamantaparas, who left behind one of India's earliest long inscriptions in polished Sanskrit, a sign that foreign kings were learning not only to rule India, but to speak her language. His inscription at Girnar, carved on an old Ashokan rock, praises his wisdom, valor, and mastery of music and grammar. It's hard not to admire the irony, the conqueror of cities, humbly showing off his Sanskrit grammar homework. But the Shakas, too, would soon be absorbed by a greater tide from the north, the Kushans. They came from farther east, descendants of the Yuezhi, a nomadic confederation pushed out of China's western frontier. Around the 1st century CE, one branch of them, led by a dynamic ruler named Kujala Kadphises, consolidated power in Bactria and Gandhara, founding the Kushan Empire. His successors expanded into the Ganges Plain, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, bridging worlds as no empire before had done. And then came Kanishka the Great, the most famous of them all. Reigning in the 2nd century CE, he was both conqueror and patron, a man whose empire linked Rome, Persia, India, and China along the arteries of the Silk Road. His capital, Purusapura, modern Peshawar, gleamed with stupas and temples. Traders from Alexandria to Xi'an passed through his cities. Coins bearing his name turned up in places as far apart as Samarkand and the Ganges. Kanishka's coins were a manifesto of pluralism. On one side, the king stands crowned and haloed. On the other, gods from a dozen traditions, Greek Helios, Persian, Mithra, Indian Shiva, even the Buddha himself, each labeled in Greek script. It was empire not by exclusion, but by inclusion, a spiritual crossroads stamped in silver. Under Kanishka's patronage, Buddhism reached new heights. He convened the 4th Buddhist Council in Kashmir, which codified scriptures and fostered the rise of Mahayana Buddhism, the great vehicle. It was here that the Buddha began to be seen, not just as a teacher, but as a cosmic savior whose compassion encompassed all beings. From this idea would later emerge bodhisattvas figures who postponed their own enlightenment to guide others. From the Kushan heartland, Buddhist monks and merchants carried these new ideas along the Silk Road into Central Asia and China. The serene Gandhara Buddhas they bore became models for statues as far away as Dunhuang and Luoyang. The art and philosophy of India were now global exports riding the same caravans as silk spices and ivory. And while the Kushans ruled the north, the south continued to pulse with its own vitality, the Tamil kingdoms of the Cholas Cheras and Pandyas trading with Rome and Arabia. Across the subcontinent, coins jingled, stupas rose, and languages evolved. The borders of power shifted, but the web of culture only grew denser. In this age of exchange, India ceased to be a secluded subcontinent and became part of a planetary network. Greek thinkers debated Buddhist ideas. Chinese monks copied Sanskrit sutras. Roman gold glittered in Deccan ports. While the north was busy mingling Greeks and Kushans, another world thrived far to the south, a world of fiery sun salt winds and a language as old as the stones. This was Tamilakam, the land of the Tamil-speaking peoples, where poetry, trade, and pride wove together into a civilization so distinct and self-assured that it called itself simply the world below the Vindhyas, and it hardly cared what the empires of the north were doing. Here, amid red soil and tropical monsoon, arose the Sangam Age, a golden age of southern culture named after the Sangams, or literary academies, where poets and scholars gathered to shape a canon of beauty, war, and wisdom. The time roughly spanned from the 3rd century BCE to the 3rd century CE, though the verses themselves seem timeless, bright with the scent of jasmine iron and sea spray. The Tamil kingdoms were threefold: the Cholas, the Pandyas, and the Cheras, each ruling coastal plains and hill country, each jealous of the other's glory, and each producing poets who praised, mocked, and immortalized their kings in verse. The Pandyas ruled from Madurai, where the Sangam poets supposedly gathered under royal patronage. Madurai was a city of temples and markets, its streets buzzing with spice sellers, goldsmiths, and wandering bards, reciting epics in the rhythm of the drum. The Cheras, farther west in modern-day Kerala, commanded the fertile Malabar coast, where monsoon rains fattened the forests and rivers poured into the sea. Their port of Muziris, known to the Romans as Muchiri, was one of the busiest in the ancient world. Here ships from Alexandria, Arabia, and the Red Sea anchored beside Tamil catamarans, trading pepper pearls, ivory and fine cotton for Roman gold and amphorae of wine. Roman writers were dazzled by this faraway land, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. A Greek maritime guide from the 1st century CE describes Musaris as abounding in ships sent with cargoes from Arabia and by Greeks. Archaeologists have found Roman coins by the thousands in southern India gold aurae, stamped with the profiles of emperors from Augustus to Nero, lying silent beneath the palms of Kerala. On the eastern coast, the Cholas thrived bold maritime and restless. Their capital at Urayur, and later Kavarapattinam Puhar, was a bustling port city where ships from across the Indian Ocean exchanged silk and sandalwood pearls and coral. Chola inscriptions and Sangam poems describe the harbor filled with sails like white swans in the sunlight. The Chola kings were both warriors and patrons of art. They led armies into the hills and across the sea, yet they also sponsored poets who sang of love and loss with the same passion they sang of battle. One verse from the Purana Nuru, a collection of early Tamil poems, captures this balance perfectly. The king who feeds the hungry is greater than the king who conquers 100 lands. The Sangam poets divided the world into 5 landscapes, each associated with a mood, a deity, and a kind of love. Kurunji, the mountain for secret love. Mulai, the forest for patience and waiting. Marutam, the farmland for domestic quarrels. Natal, the seashore for longing and parting. Palai, the desert, for separation and hardship. In these verses, love was a cosmos unto itself, no less worthy of poetry than war or kingship. A woman waits for her lover beneath a neem tree. A soldier's wife stares at the ocean where his ship vanished. A mother rebukes the moon for keeping her daughter awake. The Sangam age saw no boundary between the political and the personal. The same poets who praised warriors for splitting skulls also wrote tenderly of women braiding flowers into their hair. But the South was not all lyric and leisure. It was fiercely independent. The Tamil kings may have traded with the world, but they never bowed to it. While northern India cycled through Maurya Shungas, and Kushan's Tamilakam kept its own rhythm. The Brahminical Vedic order found a foothold here, but not dominance. The Tamil world absorbed Sanskrit ideas and reinterpreted them in its own idiom, local gods, regional cults, and a deep reverence for the land itself. The economy was vibrant, driven by trade and agriculture. The coastal routes that connected India to the Roman Empire made the Tamil ports some of the wealthiest in Asia. Ships laden with pepper and textiles sailed west on the monsoon winds and returned with gold glassware and wine. Roman traders, in turn, marveled at the sophistication of Tamil society, its guilds, artisans, and literate merchants. Some scholars believe that Roman colonies even existed briefly along the Malabar coast. Fragments of amphorae and Roman pottery suggest evenings of wine and debate under tropical rain. Far inland life followed older rhythms. The farmers of the Kaveri Delta irrigated their fields with precision that astonished later travelers. Warriors carried curved swords and wore garlands of victory. Bards wandered from court to court, rewarded in gold grain or elephants. And through it all ran a sense of fierce individuality. Tamilakam was not waiting for northern approval. It was already a civilization in full bloom. Religion, too, carried its own flavor. Alongside early forms of Hinduism flourished Jainism and Buddhism, whose monks and merchants played key roles in trade networks. The Buddhist stupas at Kanchipuram and the Jain carvings in the hills of Madurai speak of a pluralistic society that valued virtue and intellect as much as valor. By the early centuries, CE Tamilakam had become both gateway and garden, a region where global winds met local genius. To the west, the Red Sea carried ships from Egypt, To the east, traders ventured toward Southeast Asia, laying the first foundations of cultural links that would later flourish under the imperial Cholas. The Sangam poets may not have known it, but their verses preserved something rare in history, a civilization speaking to us, not through kings and conquests, but through feeling. Their poetry makes no mention of great empires, but it breathes with humanity the smell of wet earth, the thud of drums, the sigh of a lover. When the Roman Empire was at its height, Tamilakam was not its colony, but its equal, a far southern world that traded silk for gold and verse for eternity. And when Rome eventually fell, the ports of Muziris and Arikamedu still glimmered in the sun, their harbors filled with sails, their poets still singing of love and war. For in this southern renaissance, the pen and the plow, the heart and the sword, all worked in harmony, and the land below the Vindhyas found its eternal voice. After centuries of flux Greek kings in the northwest, Tamil poets in the south, traders bridging seas and steppes India was ready for a new kind of unity. But this time, empire would not march in armor. It would glide in silk. The coming centuries would shimmer not with conquest alone, but with culture, language, art, and learning drawn together into a luminous whole. Historians call it the Gupta age. Poets called it the age when the earth wore jewels again. It began modestly around the early 4th century CE, with a dynasty whose origins are still partly veiled. The Guptas were likely local rulers from the fertile plains of the Ganges, perhaps from the region of Magadha, ironically the same land that had birthed the Mauryas centuries before. But where the Mauryas had been iron and bureaucracy, the Guptas were gold and grace. They didn't just restore empire, they refined it. The founder, Chandragupta, was a small but strategic player. Around 320 CE, he married Kumaradevi, a princess from the powerful Lichavi clan, binding diplomacy and legitimacy into one alliance. With this union, he proclaimed himself Maharajadiraja, King of Kings, and laid the foundation for an empire that would stretch across northern India, from Bengal to the Arabian Sea. His son, Samudragupta, transformed that foundation into greatness. If Chandragupta was the architect, Samudragupta was the sword. Inscriptions describe him as the exterminator of all kings, but his wars were as much art as aggression, precise, efficient, and brilliantly chronicled on the Allahabad pillar, where his deeds were inscribed in polished Sanskrit prose. It reads like an imperial resume, carved in stone. He conquered the eastern kingdoms, subdued the south, humbled the frontier tribes, and brought the Himalayas and the seas under his sway. Yet it was not blind conquest. Samudragupta often reinstated defeated rulers as vassals, turning enemies into allies. His genius lay in balance, the art of ruling through strength tempered by diplomacy. He was also a patron of culture. Court poets praised him not only as a warrior, but as a musician who played the veena, the Indian lute. Picture it, an emperor who could crush kingdoms by day and compose love songs by night. If Ashoka had been a moralist and Chandragupta a strategist, Samudragupta was a romantic, a man who saw beauty as power's equal. His successor, Chandragupta II, carried the empire to its zenith. Known as Vikramaditya, the son of valor, he expanded westward, defeating the Shakas and bringing Gujarat under Gupta control. This conquest opened the sea routes that reconnected India to global trade, ensuring that silk, spices, and ideas once again flowed between India-Rome's remnants and China. Chandragupta II's court became the beating heart of a golden age. Its capital, Pataliputra, still magnificent, was now joined by cities like Ujjain and Nalanda, glowing centers of art and learning. Poets, astronomers, sculptors, and mathematicians flourished under royal patronage. The court legends speak of the Navaratnas, the nine jewels, a constellation of genius said to include the poet Kalidasa, the astronomer Varahamihira, and the grammarian Amarasimha. If history ever had a dream of elegance, it was here. Kalidasa, the Shakespeare of Sanskrit, composed dramas so lyrical they seemed carved from moonlight. His Abhijnana Shakuntalam, the recognition of Shakuntala, blended tenderness and philosophy, telling the story of love forgotten and remembered in verses that would enchant readers from India to Goethe's Germany centuries later. His poetry celebrated the harmony between humanity and nature, the monsoon as lover, the river as mother, the earth as goddess. In his words, civilization seemed to sigh with contentment. The Guptas were not just patrons of words, but of stone. Across northern India, the first great Hindu temples began to rise, no longer just altars or caves, but sanctuaries of sculpture and geometry. The shrines of Deogar and Udayagiri, with their intricate carvings of Vishnu reclining on the cosmic serpent, marked the birth of the classical Indian temple style. The architecture was not monumental in size, but exquisite in proportion. Here, devotion was rendered in symmetry and light. Art reached a new height in refinement. At Sarnath, sculptors carved the Buddha's face with ethereal calm eyes, half-closed lips, curved in infinite gentleness. The statues of this era capture something almost impossible, serenity made visible. The Gupta smile, as art historians call it, is not a grin, but a revelation, a flicker of the soul through stone. Science, too, gleamed. The mathematician Aryabhata, writing around 499 CE, calculated the value of pi, proposed that the Earth rotates on its axis, and hinted at the concept of zero as a placeholder ideas that would travel through Arabia and transform global mathematics. In astronomy, medicine, and metallurgy, Gupta India stood at the frontier of human understanding. The Iron Pillar of Delhi, erected during this era, still stands today, unrusted after 15 centuries, a quiet testament to metallurgical mastery. Trade flourished across the empire. Gold coins bearing images of kings, playing the veena, or performing sacrifices circulated through markets and temples. These coins weren't just currency, they were art in miniature symbols of a world where piety, intellect, and prosperity coexisted. Yet for all its grandeur, the Gupta world was not some sterile utopia. It was alive, human-textured, and warm. Scholars debated philosophy in Sanskrit, while villagers sang folk songs in Prakrit and Tamil. Women composed poetry, merchants sponsored temples, and monks journeyed eastward, carrying the Dharma, along with Indian textiles and mathematics. It was an age that believed the sacred and the worldly could share the same sky. Foreign travelers marveled at what they saw. The Chinese pilgrim Fa Hien, who visited India during Chandragupta II's reign, described a land of kindness and abundance where roads were safe, hospitals served travelers, and the people lived without fear of oppression. They have no need of locks or guards, he wrote with astonishment. Honesty is their nature. Perhaps idealized, but even exaggeration needs truth for fuel. If the Mauryan Empire had ruled the body of India, the Guptas ruled its imagination. Under their reign, Sanskrit became the language of civilization, spreading from court to temple to inscription. The idea of Bharata India as a cultural whole took shape here, not through conquest, but through shared art and thought. The Guptas did not merely restore order. They restored confidence, the sense that the subcontinent was not just a land of kingdoms, but a civilization of the mind. It was an age refined, yet human, disciplined, yet tender. And as dusk fell over this golden age, its light did not die. It lingered, reflected in poetry, science, and sculpture long after the empire itself had faded from the map. To walk through India in the 5th century CE was to walk through sunlight. From the quiet monastic courtyards of Nalanda to the bustling markets of Ujjain, the air hummed with an optimism rare in history, a sense that human reason and beauty had for once found harmony. This was the Gupta Golden Age, and its brilliance lay not in the gleam of empire, but in the glow of intellect and imagination. The empire of the Guptas was a curious paradox, vast yet humane, powerful yet introspective. It was as if India, after centuries of invasion and fragmentation, had finally paused to breathe, and in that breath, to think. Across its cities, scholars, poets, and scientists were mapping the cosmos, measuring the earth, and weaving words as luminous as starlight. At the center of this intellectual blaze stood Aryabhata, born in 476 CE, possibly in Kusumapura, modern Patna. He was barely 23 when he wrote the Aryabhatya, a treatise that would echo through centuries of science. Within its Sanskrit verses lay ideas so daring that even modern readers blink in disbelief. Aryabhata calculated the value of p pi to 4 decimal places, proposed that the Earth spins on its axis, and suggested that lunar and solar eclipses were caused not by demons swallowing the sun, but by the shadows of celestial bodies. In a world where myth still mingled freely with astronomy, this was nothing short of revolutionary. The planets, he said, did not wander arbitrarily, but followed precise orbits. The heavens were not gods in motion, but geometry in grace. And then, almost as an afterthought, he hinted at a symbol that would change mathematics forever, the concept of zero as a placeholder, the breath between numbers that allows infinity to be expressed. Aryabhata's influence traveled far beyond India. Centuries later, Arab scholars would translate his work, calling him Aryabhat. Through them, his numerals and zero would pass into the hands of European mathematicians. Every calculation you make today, every phone, every equation, every orbit mapped, carries a faint echo of his verses. But he was not alone. In Ujjain, the astronomical capital of the Gupta world, another polymath, Varahamihira, was studying the heavens. His Brat Samhita, a vast compendium of astronomy, astrology, geography, and even gemology, reads like a fusion of science and wonder. He predicted rainfall patterns, mapped planetary conjunctions, and described earthquakes with a precision that would astonish later generations. Yet for all his technical mastery, Varahamihira was also a poet at heart. The earth, he wrote, is like a woman adorned by mountains, rivers, and forests. Her ornaments are the works of the gods. That was the Gupta spirit in essence, science without cynicism, knowledge without arrogance. To study the world was to adore it. And then there was Kalidasa, the poet, whose words made that world eternal. If Aryabhata gave India its mathematical grammar, Kalidasa gave it its emotional language. His plays, especially Abhijnana Shakuntalam, the recognition of Shakuntala, breathed new life into Sanskrit literature. The story is simple, yet profound. A king Dushyanta falls in love with Shakuntala, a forest maiden raised by sages. A curse makes him forget her, and only when he sees a ring she once gave him does memory return. The reunion comes not through miracles, but through the quiet ache of love remembered. Kalidasa turns mythology into intimacy, cosmic love into human longing. His verses seem to shimmer with light. I recognize her now, by the tears that fill my eyes like rain, returning to the cloud that once released it. In Kalidasa's world, gods and mortals share the same emotional gravity. He could describe a sunrise or a lover's silence with equal divinity. Nature in his hands was never backdrop, it was consciousness itself. The same refinement that shaped poetry, shaped sculpture, painting, and urban life. At Ajanta, painters unfurled entire galaxies of devotion on the walls of cave monasteries. Buddha preaching under a Bodhi tree, princes renouncing crowns, celestial musicians floating in indigo skies. Their pigments drawn from minerals and flowers still glow after 15 centuries, miraculously alive in the flicker of torchlight. Meanwhile, society itself thrived in a rhythm of order and grace. The Chinese pilgrim, Faxian Fahian, who traveled through India during the reign of Chandragupta II, left us an outsider's portrait of this radiant world. He described clean, well-governed cities, free hospitals, and compassionate laws. The people he wrote were prosperous and peaceful. Crime was rare, charity common. They have no need of locks or guards, he marveled. Honesty is their nature. He also noted the coexistence of faiths, Hindu temples, Buddhist monasteries, and Jain shrines standing side by side. The idea of pluralism, that truth has many faces, was not an argument, but a fact of life. Kings ruled through dharma, not decree. Scholars debated philosophy in courtyards without fear of heresy. It is tempting, of course, to romanticize this era as perfect. The Guptas were still monarchs. Caste divisions and patriarchy persisted. But within those limits, the civilization achieved something remarkable, a social equilibrium that allowed thought to flourish, art to breathe, and reason to thrive. Everywhere there was a sense of proportion, an aesthetic symmetry between the outer and inner worlds. The temples of the Guptas, with their balanced geometry, mirrored the balance of their philosophy. Their sculpture, with its gentle smiles and soft curves, mirrored their ethics. Even their coins, embossed with kings playing the veena, expressed the same principal power, tempered by beauty. It was in every sense a luminous age, refined yet human. Not a world of unblemished perfection, but of harmony between intellect and emotion, discovery and devotion. As dusk fell over the Gupta world, no one yet knew that the centuries ahead would bring invasion and upheaval. For now, the Ganges still shimmered in the sun, scholars still watched the stars from their observatories, and poets still sang of love and duty as if the world itself were a verse waiting to be completed. When the golden light of the Guptas dimmed, India did not fall into darkness, it transformed. The scholar's ink had hardly dried, the sculptor's chisels barely cooled, when a new kind of energy began to pulse through the land. The age of philosophers and emperors gave way to an age of devotees and builders. The next chapter of India's story would not be written on palm leaves or in royal decrees, but carved in stone and sung in love. The great empires faded as empires do. By the 6th century, CE Gupta unity had splintered into smaller kingdoms, each proud, artistic, and fiercely local. Yet through their diversity, a single cultural current flowed, the rise of temple Hinduism, and with it, the deep human voice of bhakti devotion. The Vedic fire had once burned in open altars, the sacrifice rising to unseen gods. But the world had changed. Faith was no longer a ceremony conducted by priests, it had become personal, emotional, immediate. The divine moved from sky to sanctuary, from scripture to song, from the abstraction of cosmic order to the intimacy of love. Temples became its body. In the north, the Nagara style took shape temples with tall curving spires, called shikharas, that soared like frozen flames toward the heavens. Each tower was a mountain of meaning, its walls alive with sculpture, its symmetry echoing the geometry of the cosmos. The earliest masterpieces appeared in Deoghar Bhitargaon and Khajuraho temples dedicated to Vishnu Shiva and the goddess. In the south, the Dravida style emerged, more grounded, monumental, and architectural. The towers, or vimanas, rose like tiered pyramids, each level smaller than the last, adorned with carvings of gods, guardians, and celestial dancers. Around them sprawled massive complexes with pillared halls and sculpted gateways, the ancestors of the great temples, that would one day crown Madurai, Thanjavur, and Kanchipuram. For the first time, the temple was not just a shrine, it was a universe in miniature. Its base symbolized the mortal world, its tower, the path to liberation. Pilgrims did not simply worship, they journeyed upward through architecture itself, ascending toward the divine through light and shadow. The gods, too, changed. They were no longer distant cosmic forces, but lovers, friends, and companions. The Vedic deities of thunder and flame gave way to the Trimurti Brahma, the creator Vishnu, the preserver Shiva, the destroyer, and to their myriad avatars and consorts. These gods walked among mortals in story and song, their legends carrying both grandeur and tenderness. And it was song that now ruled the spirit of India. Far to the south in the Tamil lands, a revolution was unfolding in poetry and faith. The Bhakti movement, from the Sanskrit bhaj, to share or to love, was born not in monasteries, but in the hearts of poets. The Nayanars, devotees of Shiva, and the Alvars, devotees of Vishnu, roamed from village to temple, singing hymns of love so passionate that they blurred the line between religion and romance. Their language was not Sanskrit, the tongue of courts and scholars, but Tamil, the language of the people. And their poetry was electric. In it, God was not an abstraction, but a beloved, sometimes a child, sometimes a lover, sometimes a lord, so beautiful that the poet trembled in his presence. The Alvar, Saint Andal, the only woman among them, wrote verses of longing that read like divine love letters. I dream of him, my dark one, with eyes like lotus petals, my heart melting like wax before a flame. The Shaiva poet, Apar, sang of Shiva, not as a distant destroyer, but as the one who lifts him from sorrow. When my mind was a storm, he became its stillness. When my body was dust, he became its dance. These songs spread like wildfire. They crossed caste, gender, and class. Farmers, merchants, kings, and courtesans sang them alike. In an era when ritual had grown remote and priests guarded the gates of salvation, the Bhakti saints kicked those gates open with music. Their message was simple and revolutionary. God does not need your offerings, only your heart. Temples echoed their voices. Stone itself seemed to vibrate with rhythm. Sculptors carved Shiva as Nataraja, the cosmic dancer whose steps keep the universe alive. The circle of fire around him became a symbol of creation and destruction in perfect balance. Vishnu's avatars appeared in frescoes and reliefs, Rama with his bow, Krishna playing his flute beneath flowering trees, surrounded by adoring gopis whose eyes mirrored devotion's ecstasy. The Bhakti movement transformed not only religion, but society. It offered spiritual equality where social hierarchy had long prevailed. It taught that salvation was open to all Brahmin and outcast man and woman, scholar and shepherd. Its songs were composed in every vernacular tongue that India would one day speak: Tamil, Kannada, Marathi, Hindi, Bengali. Even in the north, the devotional current rose. Poets like Surdas Kabir and Mirabai would later carry its flame, but its spark began here in the southern wind, where love became theology and poetry became prayer. And as faith took root in stone, it also soared in architecture. Temples multiplied across the subcontinent, each one a fusion of geometry, myth, and devotion. The Kailasanatha temple at Kanchipuram and the rock-cut marvels of Ellora are hymns in granite, their walls alive with gods, mid-dance saints, mid-song, and pilgrims mid-prayer. This was a civilization reimagining divinity, not through conquest, but through art. In sculpture, the gods smiled. In song, they wept. In architecture, they ascended. The Guptas had given India refinement. The Bhakti age gave it emotion. And that emotion would ripple outward for 1,000 years, shaping everything from the bronze of Chola Madurai to the verses of medieval mystics. In this world of temple towers and heart-born hymns, faith had ceased to be instruction, it had become experience. The gods no longer waited for offerings. They lived in the pulse of music, in the scent of incense, in the whisper of the lover, calling the divine by name. India had found a new language for the infinite, and it spoke it in stone and song. The golden hush of the Gupta centuries faded, and once again, the great wheel of Indian history turned. The vast unity that had stretched from the Himalayas to the seas dissolved not into chaos, but into constellations, brilliant distinct kingdoms, orbiting a shared civilizational light. The age that followed was one of regional pride, cultural cross-pollination, and a new kind of power, less imperial, more artistic. By the 7th century CE, the map of India glittered with names both fierce and poetic. Harsha in the north, the Chalukyas in the Deccan, the Pallavas in the south, and 100 smaller realms flickering between them like stars. The empires were gone, but the energy of civilization had not dimmed. It had simply learned to flow through a network instead of a single throne. The northern light, Harsha of Kanauj. In the fertile plains of the Ganges, a young ruler rose who seemed for a moment to resurrect the lost grandeur of the Guptas. His name was Harsha, king of Thanesar, and later Kanauj. Born around 590 CE, Harsha came to power after a family tragedy, his brother slain, his sister widowed, his dynasty shattered. What followed was a rise so swift and skillful that chroniclers later called him the last great Hindu emperor of the north. Harsha reunited much of northern India through diplomacy, conquest, and generosity. He built alliances with kings and monks alike, ruling not through fear, but through persuasion. The Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, who visited his court around 640 CE, described him as austere, compassionate, and scholarly, a monarch who rose at dawn, fasted before judgment, and gave away his treasures to monasteries and the poor. His capital, Kanauj, became a beacon of art, poetry, and learning. Sanskrit literature thrived. Copper plate grants recorded his donations to temples and scholars, and drama found a new royal stage. Harsha himself wrote plays, among them Nagananda, a Buddhist-themed romance of sacrifice and salvation. In his hands, kingship became an act of performance, blending politics with poetry. But even Harsha could not bind India's restless diversity for long. After his death, around 647 CE, his kingdom fractured, and northern India once again became a mosaic of regional powers. Yet the ideal of a cultured moral ruler, the Dharmaraja, endured a light no fragmentation could extinguish. The Deccan dynasties, the Chalukyas and their rivals. While Harsha's banners fluttered on the Ganges, another dynasty was chiseling its legend into the stone of the Deccan Plateau, the Chalukyas. From their capitals at Aihole, Badami, and later Patadakal, the Chalukyas ruled much of peninsular India from the 6th to the 8th centuries. Their world was one of red sandstone cliffs, winding rivers, and an artistic ambition as vast as their geography. It was here that Indian architecture leapt from rock to eternity. The Chalukya kings, particularly Pulakeshin II, commissioned temples not built, but carved directly from the cliff shrines that seemed to have grown from the earth itself. At Aihole, more than 100 temples, rose some early experiments, some masterpieces showing the transition from Gupta simplicity to medieval splendor. The Durga temple, with its horseshoe-shaped tower and pillared veranda, looks almost Roman in outline, but pulses with Indian rhythm. At Badami Cave, temples were hollowed into the sandstone hills, each chamber dedicated to a different deity. Vishnu, reclining on the serpent, Shiva, dancing in cosmic ecstasy, Jain Tirthankaras, meditating in silence. In these sanctuaries were theology turned into geometry, light filtering across carvings that still glow like gold at sunset. Pulakeshin II, the greatest of the Chalukyas, was not just a builder, but a statesman. His empire stretched across the Deccan and stood strong enough to repel even the ambitions of northern kings. When Harsha marched south to test his might, Pulakeshin met him at the Narmada River and stopped him cold. The Narmada became not a border of hostility, but of respect, marking the meeting point of two great realms. The southern patrons, the Pallavas farther south, in the coastal plains of Tamil Nadu. The Pallavas were crafting another jewel of Indian civilization. From their capital at Kanchipuram, they ruled between the 6th and 9th centuries, transforming architecture, literature, and religion into art forms of breathtaking originality. Their kings, Mahendravarman, Ryan and his son, Narasimhavarman. Mamala were warrior philosophers, patrons of both Shaivism and Vaishnavism, and tireless builders. The Pallavas pioneered the transition from rock-cut caves to freestanding structural temples. Their crowning achievement was Mahabalipuram, Mamalapuram, a port city carved into the seashore itself. Here, the famous Pancharathas, 5 monolithic temples, shaped like chariots, stand lined up under the open sky, each dedicated to a different deity, each hewn from a single block of granite. Nearby, the massive descent of the Ganges relief spills across an entire cliff face, gods, sages, and animals frozen in a dance of stone as the sacred river flows from heaven to earth. To walk through Mahabalipuram is to feel motion in stillness, the sea roaring beyond the wind, whispering through centuries, the granite gods listening in silence. A world of shared ideals. Though each kingdom had its own script, dialect, and deity, they were bound by Sanskrit cosmopolitanism, a shared language of learning politics and art. A poet from Kashmir could write for a patron in Kanchipuram. A mathematician from Ujjain could correspond with scholars from the south. Sanskrit served as the connective tissue of an India too vast for a single crown. Yet alongside Sanskrit, the vernaculars Tamil, Kannada, Telugu, Prakrit were blossoming. The age of Bhakti poets, begun in Tamilakam, now spread northward. Regional courts began to value the rhythms of their own languages. Copper plate inscriptions were issued not only in Sanskrit, but in local tongues, recording grants of land to Brahmins' temples and monasteries. The economy, too, pulsed with vigor. Merchant guilds and temple networks managed trade routes that stretched across the Indian Ocean. Ports in the south connected to Southeast Asia, while inland caravans carried spices, textiles, and metalwork to Persia and China. Kings funded temples not just as acts of faith, but as engines of prosperity, centers of production, education, and social welfare. India in this era was not a single empire, it was a civilizational ecosystem. Each region contributed its own genius, the philosophical grace of Kashmir, the maritime daring of the Cholas, the sculptural power of the Deccan, the lyrical devotion of the Tamil poets. From the Ganges to the Kaveri stone, and song spoke the same language, Dharma. The gods had many names, but the ideals were shared: justice, generosity, beauty, and the eternal search for balance between power and piety. It was an age of fragmentation, yes, but also of flowering. And in those separate kingdoms, the pulse of India beat on steady and magnificent, like a constellation whose stars shine brightest when seen together. The rivers had long since changed their courses, empires had risen and fallen like tides, but India's story still flowed restless and radiant. And in the south, where the Kaveri River wound through green plains and bronze towers shimmered under the sun, the flame of civilization blazed again. Its name was the Chola Empire, and for a time it made the Indian Ocean its mirror. By the 10th century CE, the Cholas had transformed from regional kings into oceanic emperors. Their line traced its roots deep into Tamil legend, but under Rajaraja R. 985 or 1014, the Cholas stepped into history's bright center. He was not merely a conqueror. He was an organizer, an artist, a visionary. With methodical brilliance, he expanded his realm across southern India, annexed Sri Lanka, and subdued the Cheras and Pandyas. His empire was as disciplined as it was vast. Local governance thrived through self-managing village assemblies sabhas, while the central administration pulsed from his new capital at Thanjavur, a city of temples, canals, and bronze workshops that glowed in the tropical light like a carved jewel. At its heart stood his masterpiece, the Brihadshvara Temple, a monument so grand it seemed carved from a single dream. Built from granite blocks, towering over 60 meters high, its Vimana temple tower soared like a mountain of stone crowned by a single 80-ton capstone placed with an engineering precision that still baffles architects. Its walls were covered with inscriptions and frescoes, hymns to Shiva, records of gifts, even details of dancers and musicians who served in its sacred halls. The temple was not just a shrine, it was a symphony in architecture. When sunlight struck its apex, it gleamed like fire. When the moon rose, the bronze Nataraja within glowed as if alive forever, dancing the rhythm of creation and dissolution. The Cholas had turned devotion into geometry, faith into engineering, and power into art. But Rajaraja's ambition was not bounded by the land. He built a navy, the first great maritime force in Indian history. His ships, constructed from teak and ironwood, carried soldiers and merchants across the Bay of Bengal. Under his son, Rajendra Chola, Urar 1014-1044, those sails reached even farther across the Andaman Sea to Srivijaya in Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, and as far as the coasts of Cambodia and Vietnam. The Chola fleet did not come only for conquest. It came bearing trade temples and Tamil culture. Across Southeast Asia, Indian influence blossomed again. Sanskrit inscriptions, Hindu and Buddhist temples, royal ceremonies, and even Indian-style kingship took root in distant lands. Yet the Cholas did not build colonies. They built connections. Their power radiated outward not through occupation, but through culture and commerce. At home, they presided over a civilization at its artistic peak. The bronze casters of Thanjavur and Gangaikonda, Cholapuram, created icons so delicate that centuries later, art historians would simply call them Chola bronzes, as if no other name were needed. The most famous, the Nataraja of Shiva, captures the god mid-dance, one leg lifted hair, flying surrounded by a ring of fire. In that image, the Cholas captured the eternal pulse of the universe, the stillness within motion, creation within destruction. The Chola age was not merely the South's renaissance, it was the last great flowering of ancient India. While their ships glided eastward, the world beyond the subcontinent was shifting. In the northwest, new powers had begun to rise, riders from Central Asia, whose banners bore the crescent moon. After the decline of the Cholas in the 13th century, India's political landscape fragmented once again. In the north, the Rajputs, warrior clans of dazzling valor and stubborn pride, ruled from stone citadels that gleamed like embers in the desert sun. From Chittor to Kanauj, they upheld ideals of honor and loyalty, their poets singing of courage even in defeat. Yet their valor could not stop the tide pressing through the mountain passes. Beginning in the 11th century, waves of Turco-Afghan invasions swept across the northwest. Among them rode Mahmud of Ghazni, the plunderer king, whose raids struck at the wealth of Indian temples and cities. For 17 campaigns, he rode into India, leaving behind burning shrines and shaken kingdoms. Yet even as he looted its gold, he could not touch its spirit, the culture too vast, too ancient to be conquered by iron alone. The centuries that followed brought both turbulence and transformation. By 1206, the Delhi Sultanate was founded, ushering in an era of new rulers, new faiths, and new syntheses. Persian calligraphy would soon meet Sanskrit poetry. Domes and minarets would rise beside temple towers. A new India was about to be born, still Indian, yet different. And thus, the age of the ancients passed not with collapse, but with continuity. From the Neolithic villages of Mehrgarh to the marble temples of Thanjavur, from the hymns of the Vedas to the love songs of the Bhakti saints, from the philosophers of Nalanda to the navigators of the Chola seas, every era had sung its verse in the long melody of civilization. India's past was never one story, but 1,000 stories intertwining. It was a civilization that could be broken but never silenced. From the farmers of Mehrgarh to the builders of Thanjavur, the story of ancient India is not one civilization, but many voices in one unbroken song.